So there are two theories for how the gas giants formed. One is the same theory I showed you just now, core accretion, right? And the other is called disk instability. And one of our colleagues at DTM has done a lot of work on that. And so it's unclear exactly how they formed, but you're right, what we're trying to do, the reason we're trying to get to higher and higher pressure in the lab is because we're trying to understand more about the pressure inside the gas giants. It's thought that the gas giants also have a metallic core, but maybe a metallic core not made of iron. Hydrogen, for example, becomes metallic at a certain pressure. Okay, so it's very possible that the insides of these planets could have metallic cores, could have hydrogen cores, could have rocky portions. We're not sure, but the higher pressure we can get in the lab, the higher the pressure we can get in the lab, the closer we can get to understanding the interiors of the gas giants and the exoplanets that are so big.
Hello, everyone. Today's lecture is about setting up a website. I'm going to be focusing on things that you need to consider to ensure your website really adds value to the people using it. So, there are three main areas you need to think about. The first and most important thing is who is your target audience. When you're creating a new website, you really need to think about who the users are and what information they'll be looking for. What we do when we set up websites is to group users based on their needs. So, for a website in the academic community, for example, we may have groups such as researchers and administrators, and this helps us design the site and add information that is relevant to each group. The second point is accessibility. The main thing here is to ensure your website can be found. And you can do this by making sure it can be reached from areas on the web where your target audience are also active. So this may mean providing links on other websites, or maybe using social media. And thirdly, retention. Making sure your target audience return to your website regularly. You do this by ensuring it gives them a reason to come back, so it's important to keep the site up to date and make sure it provides the latest news and interesting information and so on.
Supersymmetry is a mathematical idea that people have developed in effort to understand the sharpest organizing principle for the fundamental constituents of matter. You see, we have learned that particles that seem to be different can actually secretly be united by certain symmetry principles. So we're used to the fact that there are symmetric objects in the world like a sphere or a basketball. You turn a sphere, and even though you've transformed it, it looks the same, fundamentally. We found that certain particles, when you transform one particle into another, even though it looks like the identity of the particle has changed, overall the equations describing it, they don't change at all, an underlying level of symmetry. But what we've not been able to do is find a symmetry that would relate certain kinds of particles, namely matter particles and force particles. Matter particles are particles like electrons and muons, quarks. Force particles are like photons and gluons and WZ bosons. Supersymmetry is a symmetry that actually relates these two kinds, these two classes of particles. And people have proven that supersymmetry is the last possible symmetry of the fundamental particles that our mathematics, reality, has not yet been shown to make use of. So people are now trying to see whether that symmetry might actually be at work in the world. Can we find evidence for it in our understanding of the fundamental particles?
In today's lecture, I'm going to talk about changes in air pollution since the middle of the last century and what has created these changes. So, by the 1950s, air pollution was very visible, with frequent thick black fogs known as smogs in many large cities around the world. The main source of this pollution was from factories, and it caused severe health problems. For example, a particularly severe smog in London in 1952 caused over 4,000 deaths. Obviously, something had to be done, and in 1956 a Clean Air Act was introduced in Britain. This addressed the pollution from factories, and the smog soon disappeared. However, as you know, these days air pollution is still a big issue. The main difference between now and the 1950s is that you can't see it. It's invisible. Also, the main source of pollution now is from cars and lorries, and although these don't produce visible signs, this air pollution is still a significant risk to health. And one of the key factors in the rise of this type of pollution is that we have all become much more vehicle dependent. There are far more cars and lorries, trains and planes than in the 1950s, and this is now the main source of air pollution around the world.
From reading philosophy, I came up with 3 principles as the guiding principles for a just city. The principles of equity, democracy, and diversity. These were derived from the works of a number of philosophers, most preeminently, I suppose, John Rawls. My choice of the word equity rather than equality is in fact based on Rawls's argument that a policy ought to distribute benefits to people where the worst off become better off. So the worst off don't have to become equal to everybody else, but no policy should in fact make those who are most disadvantaged more disadvantaged. And it means that we have to talk about the policy at the time it's being enacted. To say, well, we have to make our city more competitive because sometime in the by and by, the benefits will trickle down to those people who are worst off, doesn't justify making them worst off at the time. We have a lot of examples in the world of people whose homes were destroyed in the name of the greater good and said, well, eventually they will benefit. But equity means that you do not, in fact, take advantage of those people who are weakest.
Conduct disorder in children is very serious. It's a disorder of childhood and adolescence that is long-term, that's chronic, where children have very aggressive impulses, where children are involved in difficulties with the law and really seem to have no disregard for the rules or for authority. When children have conduct disorder, they're definitely at risk of carrying these difficulties into adulthood, which also brings about a myriad of different problems. Children with conduct disorder often have difficulties in schools, have difficulty with relationships, and have difficulty with employment and lifelong, long-term relationships. It's important to recognize that if your child is not doing well in school, if your child has had difficulties where legal action was necessary, if your child is bullying, getting into fights, and this is constant and ongoing, if your child does not get help, these complexities will really exacerbate into other major difficulties. Look for signs of your child's grades dropping, look for signs of repeated detentions, suspensions, and brushes with the law. Parents, please recognize that if your child has signs of conduct disorder, the sooner you get help, the sooner your child can start to learn more adaptive behaviors.
I suppose that it has always been the case for the majority of us that the first test of a work of art, or literature, or music is how much pleasure it gives us, and we don't want to bother with analysing why or how it has had such an emotional impact on us. It's always good to know what your pleasures are in the positive sense, and not as easy as some people think, as opposed to only really knowing what you don't like and complaining about it, though presumably there's some kind of pleasure to be had from that too. But now that you've chosen to take a course on the novel, I'm afraid that evaluating literature on the basis of how you feel about a book won't count as an intelligent, critical response to the work being studied. It is, however, useful to remind yourselves from time to time that we all fall for trash every now and again. For instance, you might actually enjoy listening to a catchy pop song, but you'd find it hard to explain in critical terms that it is good or better than something else just because it is enjoyable. So, you're here to sharpen up your critical knives, as it were, among other things, of course.
In an article that you wrote that I just read, you said you wished you could take everyone back to decades ago to look at the Florida Keys.
50 years ago, think about how much change has taken place in that short period of time. We have managed to consume on the order of 90% of the big fish in the ocean, the tunas, the swordfish, the sharks. They're mostly gone. Until recently, people have had the belief that there isn't much we puny human beings could do to change the nature of the ocean, but in fact, we have, not just because of what we've been taking out, and the destructive means often applied to take fish and other creatures from the sea, but also what we're putting into the sea, either directly or what we put into the atmosphere that falls back into the sea.
So if you were going to give a grade on the health of the oceans today, what would it be?
Well, it depends on which aspect. Across the board, the oceans are in trouble. It's hard for me to assign a specific grade, maybe C-.
This week I'd like to start by talking a bit about electric vehicles. Although we tend to think of electric cars as being something completely modern, they were in fact some of the earliest types of motorized vehicle. At the beginning of the 20th century, electric cars were actually more popular than cars with an internal combustion engine, as they were more comfortable to ride in. However, as cars fueled by petrol increased in importance, electric cars declined. The situation became such that electric vehicles were only used for certain specific purposes, as forklift trucks, ambulances, and urban delivery vehicles, for example. Although electricity declined in use in road vehicles, it steadily grew in importance as a means of powering trains. Switzerland, for example, was quick to develop an electrified train system, encouraged in this, no doubt, by the fact that it had no coal or oil resources of its own. Nowadays, there is renewed interest in electricity as a means of powering road vehicles. Why is this the case? Well, undoubtedly, economic reasons are of considerable importance. The cost of oil has risen so sharply that there is a strong financial imperative to look for an alternative. However, there are also environmental motivations. Emissions from cars are blamed in large part for, among other things, the destruction of the ozone layer and the resultant rise in temperatures in the polar regions. A desire not to let things get any worse is also encouraging research into designing effective electric transport.
So, continuing our series of lectures on modernism, we now turn to architecture, and in particular to the work of Frank O'Gary. Now, I'm not going into his career in detail. It's enough to say that early on he was, like other modernist architects, tied to the rectangle, the straight line, and so on. Often their buildings would have this basic shape, and they would just add bits of decoration like splashes of color or pointless balconies. Soon enough, Gary wanted to break away from straight lines and grid-like designs. He wanted the freedom to experiment with other shapes, curves, and unusually angled roofs. What helped him was the work with the computer, which allowed him to visualize and experiment with complex shapes and to work on the whole design as one piece, without the added decoration being thrown in as an afterthought. Architecture as an art, if you like, or sculpture even. He himself said he had struggled with crossing the line between architecture and sculpture. Now, I want to talk about one building in particular, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, which I think you'll agree is a masterpiece.
A dimension of space is basically an independent direction in which, in principle, you could move, you could walk. So when we talk about left-right, you can freely move left-right. Back-forth, you can freely move back-forth. And up-down, you can freely move up-down as well. If you consider a diagonal direction, that's not a new dimension because that's just a combination of moving this way and that way. So when we talk about dimensions, we're talking about the independent directions in which you can move. Another way of thinking about dimensions, they are the data that needs to be specified in order to delineate where something takes place. So if you're having a dinner party, you give your friend a street, a cross street, and a floor number. 3 pieces of information to nail down a location in 3 dimensions of space. According to string theory, in reality, you need to give your friend more than just those 3 pieces of information. If you really want him or her to know where to go, you need to tell them coordinates, data that specifies where in the extra dimensions the dinner party is taking place too. But because the extra dimensions we think are so small, it doesn't matter to your friend, whether they show up exactly at the right location, the extra dimensions or not, because things are not able to penetrate them in any meaningful way. But that's what a dimension would be. It's a piece of data necessary to delineate where something takes place. There are four fundamental forces at work in the universe. Some of them are very familiar from everyday life, some of them are not. So we all know about gravity. That's one of the four forces. It's what keeps us anchored to the surface of the Earth, keeps the Earth in orbit around the sun. There's another force that we're all very familiar with, which is the electromagnetic force. That's the force that is responsible for electricity, electric currents, for light, for the sun's light. That's the electromagnetic radiation coming from the sun to the Earth. There are two other forces, though, that are somewhat less familiar, and they're the nuclear forces. They are forces that are at work within the nuclei of atoms. One of those forces is called the strong nuclear force. That really is a force that binds protons to protons, binds the quarks inside of the protons and neutrons, keeping them from flying out. The other nuclear force is called the weak nuclear force. And that's a force that predominantly we know of because it's responsible for radioactivity, radioactive decay. So those four forces, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear force, electromagnetic force, and the gravitational force, those are the forces at work in the universe.
One of the keys to Apple is Apple's an incredibly collaborative company. And so, you know how many committees we have at Apple?
No.
0. We have no committees.
No committees.
We are organized like a startup. One person's in charge of iPhone OS software. One person's in charge of Mac hardware. One person's in charge of iPhone hardware engineering. Another person's in charge of worldwide marketing. Another person's in charge of operations. We're organized like a startup. We're the biggest startup on the planet. And we all meet for 3 hours once a week, and we talk about everything we're doing, the whole business. And there's tremendous teamwork at the top of the company, which filters down to tremendous teamwork throughout the company. And teamwork is dependent on trusting the other folks to come through with their part without watching them all the time, but trusting that they're going to come through with their parts. And that's what we do really well. And we're great at figuring out how to divide things up into these great teams that we have and all work on the same thing, touch bases frequently, and bring it all together into a product. We do that really well. And so what I do all day is meet with teams of people and work on ideas and solve problems to make new products, to make new marketing programs, whatever it is.
And are people willing to tell you you're wrong?
Yeah.
I mean, other than snarky journalists. I mean, people that work for you.
Oh, yeah. No, we have wonderful arguments.
And do you win them all? Or?
Oh, no, I wish I did. Oh, see, you can't. If you want to hire great people and have them stay working for you, you have to let them make a lot of decisions, and you have to be run by ideas, not hierarchy. The best ideas have to win.
So,
otherwise, good people don't stay.
But you must be more than a facilitator who runs meetings. You obviously contribute your own ideas.
I contribute ideas, sure. Well, why would I be there if I didn't?
Across the world, people have been watching the choice that Britain has made. I would reassure those markets and investors that Britain's economy is fundamentally strong. And I would also reassure Brits living in European countries and European citizens living here that there will be no immediate changes in your circumstances. There will be no initial change in the way our people can travel, in the way our goods can move, or the way our services can be sold. We must now prepare for a negotiation with the European Union. This will need to involve the full engagement of the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland governments to ensure that the interests of all parts of our United Kingdom are protected and advanced. But above all, this will require strong, determined and committed leadership. I'm very proud and very honoured to have been Prime Minister of this country for 6 years. I believe we've made great steps, with more people in work than ever before in our history, with reforms to welfare and education, increasing people's life chances, building a bigger and stronger society, keeping our promises to the poorest people in the world, and enabling those who love each other to get married, whatever their sexuality. But above all, restoring Britain's economic strength.
Okay, to help you with your research, I just wanted to give you some tips today on using focus groups. These are groups of people that you get together to find out about their opinions and attitudes. For example, to review a piece of work, or just basically provide some collective input to help you with whatever you're researching. First of all, how large should a focus group be? Well, I would say that an ideal number of participants is around 6 or 7. If it's any bigger, what quite often happens is they break into side conversations and the focus is lost. If it's any smaller, you may not get the range of views that you need to get a really good discussion. Secondly, it's important that you have a moderator for the group who's able to facilitate and guide the discussions. The moderator must ensure that everyone participates and stop anyone dominating. And also, the moderator needs to make sure that the discussions don't go off in the wrong direction. And thirdly, in order to help the group focus on what's required, some basic materials should be used, particularly to kick-start the discussions. This may be in the form of pictures, photos, diagrams, graphs, etc., and will help the group to understand the context of what needs to be discussed.
We actually have seen more than one of these black hole emergers. We've seen actually 2 about equally good, although the one that we talked about, you can see with your eyes. The second one is one with lighter black holes in it. They're not so heavy, and the ringing is a lot longer, and you can't see it without all the fancy data analysis. And then there's a third source, which we already have published, but now that we have seen that, the other one, we also believe that could very well be a black hole pair. So we have 3 sources, let's call it 3 sources, in 3 months. Now, if we make design sensitivity, we have improved the apparatus by another factor of 3. Now, how does that translate into rate? It turns out if you look with a sensitivity 3 times better than we have, you can look 3 times deeper into the universe. And that says the volume of the universe that you're looking at is 3 to the cube. So that's about 27, or call it 30 in round numbers. So instead of seeing 1 a month of these black hole pairs, we should see 1 or maybe 1 every 2 days and 1 every day. That's going to change the character of how we operate completely. At that moment, launched into what I call the astronomy that's associated with gravitational wave astronomy. That's going to be a big day.
The internet is changing everything. The world of language in the future is totally different from the world of language in the past. And the reason is quite simple. There is more written language on the internet now than in all the libraries of the world combined. We've never seen anything like it before, and we haven't seen anything yet. When you're talking about the future of a language, we're asking about its long-term prospects. Where do they essentially lie? And my answer is they lie in the young people. They lie especially in the hands of the teenagers. The teenagers are the parents of the next generation of children. If teenagers are going to succeed in maintaining the intergenerational transmission of a language, then they have got to be enthused about the minority language, the endangered language that their parents and others speak. So how do you get teenagers enthused, is the question. Well, there's no question today. The only thing that enthuses teenagers, apart from sex, is the internet and all the electronic world. And so that is the area where one has got to focus. A minority language has got to get itself up electronically in all the varieties that are available to it. Now, in the case of something like Welsh, there is already quite a strong Welsh presence on the World Wide Web. And increasingly, there are Welsh chat rooms and Welsh blogs and Welsh Facebook interactions and so on. Well, this is a very, very positive sign, and it needs to be reinforced as much as possible. The future of the Welsh language, as I think all languages actually, lies in the electronic domain.
What I want to look at today is the question of how much technology, if a pen can indeed be called technology, perhaps I should say the instrument of writing, affects a writer's style and level of production. I also want to consider other factors that may have an effect on prose style, such as personality, educational background, and so on. Now, production levels aren't so hard to measure in relation to the writing instrument used. The quill pen, for instance, would need continual refilling and resharpening, which led to a leisurely, balanced style of prose, full of simple sentences. Writing took a lot longer than now, and the great novelists of the 18th century, Fielding, Smollett, Richardson, had a relatively small output, though some of their books ran to enormous length. By the middle of the 19th century, the fountain pen had been invented. It didn't need such constant refilling, which can account for the more flowing, discursive style of, say, Dickens and Thackeray, as well as their tremendous output. Then came the typewriter, whose purpose, once you got the hang of it, was to speed up the writing process, and was therefore much favoured by journalists. This, it seems to me, gave rise to a short-winded style, characterised by short sentences. A short prose style, if you like. Dictating machines and tape recorders led, as one novelist complained, to writers becoming too conversational, rambling and long-winded. Henry James, although he didn't use these machines, dictated his later novels, and, well, some might agree with this accusation. Well, it looks as though we're going to have to leave word processors, computers, and, of course, the way film and its narrative techniques have affected writing style for another day.
Now, as we all know, it has long been the habit in many countries that teachers give homework to school children of all ages. Despite the fact that a minority of educators don't agree with this practice, it has never seriously been questioned or challenged before. However, it may be that the tide is turning. These days, more people are becoming convinced that homework is of virtually no benefit, particularly for children in the younger age group. So, why have teachers always given homework? Well, the answer seems to be because they are obliged to. Most teachers don't really believe it has any real value, and the latest research supports the teachers' feelings about this. Not only does homework have very little impact on children's learning, but it also puts unnecessary obligations and responsibilities onto the parents. These days, not all families have the time or the necessary knowledge to help their offspring. So it would seem that now senior educators want to start a new initiative. Rather than giving homework, they plan to encourage reading books of any kind, just reading. And they claim that this is a far more effective method of consolidating learning than wading through piles of written homework.
Now, as urban planners, what we really need to start considering is the amount of space allocated for residential areas within a city or town. And when I say space, I'm talking about space within a dwelling or home, rather than the actual size of residential areas. There's growing concern that the internal space of new homes is becoming far smaller, too small, in fact. Maybe you're thinking, is it important for residents to have sufficient space? Is it merely a preference to have more space, or are there more serious implications? Is there, in fact, any evidence to suggest cramped living conditions affect residents' physical or mental well-being or their day-to-day life? Well, research from a number of sources indicates that this is an important issue which needs addressing. Cramped conditions can lead to aggressive behaviour, to family tensions, psychological anguish, and, in the more extreme cases, physical illness as well. Not only this, but there is a proven link between overcrowding and the social and emotional development of children, as well as their educational attainment. So, the main issue here is that residents require enough individual space to be able to live and function together, but with sufficient private space for personal time within the home.
So today we're continuing to talk about the social history of foodstuffs, and we're going on to consider next the importance of salt and the significant role it has played. Salt was a highly valued commodity in ancient times, not because it made food taste nicer, but because of the way it could be used to preserve food. This meant that people were not so dependent on seasonal variations in what was available for them to eat. They could preserve what they produced and consume it as required. It also meant that food could be transported long distances. Salt was not easy to obtain, and so prices for it were high. It was often necessary to transport it long distances, and it is believed that one of the reasons for building some of the roads that led to the ancient city of Rome was to make it easier to bring salt to the city from various parts of the Roman Empire. Roman rulers took financial advantage of the population's need for salt. When they wanted to raise money for some war or another, they raised the price of salt. Elsewhere, salt was important too. In Africa, for example, caravans consisting of up to 40,000 camels are said to have traveled 400 miles across the Sahara to transport salt to the inland markets of places like Timbuktu.
Now, you might think it strange that in a lecture on biology, I'll be talking a lot about mathematics. If I may digress a bit, when I was a student, mathematics, the language of clear abstraction, had nothing to do with life sciences like biology, the sphere of messy organic forms, cutting up frogs in the lab and so on. In fact, I started doing biology precisely to avoid maths and physics, so I've had a lot of catching up to do. We are all aware of how the sciences have come to interrelate more and more, and not only will mathematics impinge more and more on biology, but also, I'm told, in the 21st century, the driving force behind mathematics will be biology. This is partly because mathematicians are always on the lookout for more areas to conquer. But a far greater reason is that the subject has been boiled down to physics and chemistry, obvious attractions for mathematicians. A number of mathematical fields can be applied to biology. For example, knot theory is used in the analysis of the tangled strands of DNA, and abstract geometry in 4 or more dimensions is used to tell us about viruses. Again, neuroscience appears to be maths-friendly, and equations can also explain why hallucinogenic drugs cause the users to see spirals. So, if mathematicians are taking such a keen interest in biology, the least we can do as biologists is return the compliment.
It is almost impossible these days not to include photography in a course on the history of art. I disagree with people such as Walter Benjamin, who suggest that technology and art don't go well together. Photography, with its realism, its accurate representation of the thing in front of you, initially deprived many artists of their subject matter, forcing them to look in new ways. No bad thing. True, mass-produced images of, say, the Mona Lisa obviously can't provide the same experience as seeing the real painting. On the other hand, there are photographs which, to my mind, are far more thought-provoking and have greater emotional impact than a painting of the same subject ever could. Some people say that the traditional idea of an artist with a trained hand and eye is old-fashioned. They no longer believe that an artist needs specialist knowledge, but rather that he or she can simply point a camera at a scene and record it. However, on the one hand, that ignores the creative skill involved in producing photographs. On the other hand, it also ignores the fact that even in the past, painters used various technological aids. For example, the Dutch painter Vermeer used a camera obscura to help him create his images. We'll go into that later, but for now, I want to look at the documentary and cultural value of photography.
Today, I want to look at some research that has been done into what motivates people, and particularly on what is called the mindset, or more simply, the mental attitude that highly motivated people have. And, of course, the attitude of those who aren't so motivated, or who lose their motivation. Now, it's obvious that motivation is crucial to performance, but that doesn't tell us where it comes from. Why is it that some people work hard and do well, while others can work just as hard and don't? Why some are committed to what they are doing and others aren't? Finding answers to this question would be extremely useful to educators, as well as in other areas of life. Businesses, for example, have long believed that financial incentives, bonuses, perks, pay rises, are the great motivators. And, to an extent, they can make a difference. But what we are calling the mindset is more important. What has made it difficult to find out what the causes of motivation are is that motivation and the capacity for hard work can be mistaken for talent, thinking it's a gift. Either you've got it or you haven't. People who believe this have a fixed mindset and are not only going to perform less well than they could, but it's also an attitude that will affect their whole outlook on life. Some say that if talent is something people are born with and you're unlucky enough not to have any, then there's not much point in putting in all that extra effort for no real reward. However, research has shown that if you put in the hours, practice brings the same level of achievement as talent. It's a question of changing this fixed attitude and adopting a growth attitude, which includes seeing mistakes and failures as opportunities to improve.
There was a time when the subject of happiness was the business of philosophers, as part of their discussion of what makes for the good life. Then, much later, psychologists and sociologists got in on the act, and now, it seems, so has the government. I understand that governments should have the welfare and well-being of those it governs at heart, from the purely practical point of view of keeping people quiet, at home enjoying their gadgets and comfort, rather than on the streets rioting. But surely it's not something you can legislate for. Today, there are numerous journals on the topic, and it is even included in the curriculum at some universities and colleges. Surveys are done, statistics compiled, graphs drawn, yet all they seem to prove is what most people have concluded themselves from personal experience. An obvious example would be that having a lot of money doesn't necessarily make you happy. We all wish to be happy and have ideas about what it is we think would make us so. But we also know or suspect that it's not that easy. Most of us learn that it is a byproduct of something else, usually being totally absorbed or involved in some task or pastime, and can only be reached that way. These activities, of course, must be worthwhile in themselves.
One of the most surprising insights from Einstein is that time is not what we intuitively think it is, right? Most of us have this sense that time for you is the same as time for me. In some sense, there's this cosmic clock that's out there ticking second after second after second, dragging us all in exactly the same way into the future. Einstein found that if you and I are moving relative to each other, however, our clocks don't tick off time at the same rate. Our watches, if they were once in sync, if we're moving relative to each other, they fall out of synchronization. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that what I consider to be happening right now at a given moment, from your perspective, that might be the past, or it might be the future. What you consider to be happening right now, to me, that may be the past or the future. Now, since your view of reality is every bit as valid as my view of reality, that means you can't really say the past is gone, because that might be your now, your reality. You can't really say the future's yet to be. It may be the future to me. It might be your now, your reality at that given moment. So in a sense, past, present, and future are all equally real. They all exist. They're all out there. Quantum foam is an idea that emerges from the application of quantum physics to the fabric of space and time itself. You see, Einstein taught us in general relativity that space and time are not an inert backdrop. They participate in the unfolding of the cosmos. Space and time can warp and curve, and that creates the force of gravity. When you recognize that space and time are dynamic, they can change, that they're real physical entities, well, then they must be subject to the laws of quantum physics. And the key element of quantum physics that's relevant is the uncertainty principle. when applied to space and time, it says space and time are uncertain, which means they can wildly fluctuate. They can, in a sense, look like the violently boiling surface of a pot of water when you examine space and time on fantastically small scales. So the idea is if you examine space on smaller and smaller scales, not everyday scales, but tiny scales, the uncertainty gets bigger and bigger, and space and time become foam-like. They look bubbly. They look frenetic, undulating, and that's quantum foam down at the ultra-microscopic scale that we've been struggling to deal with for decades because the math of Einstein doesn't work down there, the math of quantum mechanics and the math of Einstein lock horns, and we've been trying to resolve that conflict in essence to understand what truly is going on with the quantum foam.
To be a British, the first and important thing is the freedom of speech that we have. It doesn't matter how small you are or how big you are able to shout. I think security is very important. It's a society that has democracy as its basic values. There are people who come from a third world which wasn't a British colony, where they did not have democracy as such, where they grew up under what I call a law lord or a system where the king or the local headman was the ruler of that particular area and he laid down the laws. And there are still parts of Africa as well as Middle East where the system still exists. They have to follow that ritual and that's it. They cannot argue against it. While in our British society we can argue. As the American saying go, we can fight the city hall. And this is one thing which is very unique among the Western civilization, is that any voice is heard. Well, however small it is or however big it is, we have the equal authority.
People say you have to have a lot of passion for what you're doing, and it's totally true. And the reason is because it's so hard that if you don't, any rational person would give up. It's really hard, and you have to do it over a sustained period of time. So if you don't love it, if you're not having fun doing it and you don't really love it, you're going to give up. And that's what happens to most people, actually. If you really look at the ones that ended up being successful, unquote, in the eyes of society and the ones that didn't, oftentimes it's the ones that are successful loved what they did so they could persevere when it got really tough. And the ones that didn't love it quit because they're sane, right? Who would want to put up with this stuff if you don't love it? So it's a lot of hard work and it's a lot of worrying constantly. And if you don't love it, you're going to fail. So you got to love it, you got to have passion. And I think that's the high order bit. The second thing is you've got to be a really good talent scout, because no matter how smart you are, you need a team of great people, and you've got to figure out how to size people up fairly quickly, make decisions without knowing people too well, and hire them, and see how you do and refine your intuition, and be able to help build an organization that can eventually just build itself. Because you need great people around you.
What matters is how much does each person in a household get? How much income is supporting each person in a household? Look what happens when we take that 18% figure. Remember, again, the figure I'll remind you is from 1976 until 2006, in inflation-adjusted terms, the income of the median household income in America rose only by 18%. But at the same time, the size of the household has fallen. So what's happened to the average income per person in the household? Per household person income, if you look at the income per each individual in the household over that 30-year period, we see that rose not by 18%, but by 32%. Because the number of people in a household has fallen, the amount of income earned by the household goes further per person, because you have fewer people to share the income. Each person gets a larger slice of the pie because you have fewer people sharing the pie. So just making that one adjustment, looking at what's happened to the size of households, causes that 18% figure to rise to 32%. 32% is still not great over a 30-year period, but it's different than 18%. It's a little bit more optimistic. And if nothing else, it should give you some sense that data have to be interpreted carefully.
How much sun exposure might one need to get their target vitamin D level to that found associated with the lowest total mortality rate? Well, it depends. It depends on our age, how long we're exposed, the time of day, the time of year, our latitude, our skin color, our use of sunscreen, how much of our body we're exposing. Even in Boston, though, all it takes is 10 to 12 minutes of midday summer sun without sunblock, if you're a young, pale, naked Caucasian. But then you're golden. Actually, you'd be a little pink. Note, though, if you're some old white guy prancing around naked on the commons, you're not gonna make it. As I hope you're beginning to appreciate, it's not easy to make a one-size-fits-all recommendation for how much sun exposure one might need, and low vitamin D status, despite abundant sun exposure, has been found even in the best of circumstances. Young, half-naked skateboarders in Honolulu, right, mostly Caucasian, averaging 30 hours of sun a week, and 51% didn't even make it to 30. If they can't, who can? And these days, even if we're an albino nudist at the equator, how often might we be getting outside in the middle of the day with a desk job? So, if we're really interested in getting to the vitamin D level associated with the lowest mortality rates, and our lifestyle or latitude won't allow us the necessary sun exposure, then one needs to take vitamin D supplements. The piddly amount added to soy milk, calf milk, margarine, or mushrooms would simply not be enough.
Vitamin E supplementation confirmed as a treatment for liver problems. Hi, I'm Dr. James Machino. There's a common fatty liver condition known as NASH, which is commonly seen in diabetics and pre-diabetics and people who are overweight. Now, NASH stands for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So it's a condition where you have an inflamed liver that's not caused from alcohol consumption. It's caused by faulty lifestyle behaviors, lots of fat in the diet in particular. Now, of course, alcohol consumption can also induce fatty liver problems. But with the obesity epidemic that we have at hand, more and more people are developing fatty liver disease, not from alcohol, but from faulty dietary lifestyle patterns and lack of exercise. If it's left unchecked, fatty liver problems can degenerate into cirrhosis. Now, in cirrhosis of the liver, you're getting scar tissue and fibrotic tissue, and nodules start to replace normal liver tissue. And with advancing cirrhosis, you can end up with liver failure requiring a transplant. Now, cirrhosis is the 10th leading cause of death in men in our society. It's the 12th leading cause of death in women in our society as of 2001. In 2012, new medical guidelines were issued for the management of non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, this fatty liver problem caused by high-fat diet, obesity, diabetes, pre-diabetic states. One of the major recommendations was 800 IUs of vitamin E every day. Why? Because vitamin E is one of the few agents that's ever been shown to actually reverse some of this liver damage in people that have the problem. Other studies have also shown recently that vitamin E is linked to the prevention of liver cancer in people who are high risk for primary liver cancer. Primary liver cancer is known as hepatocellular carcinoma.
The American people are fed up with partisan politics. In a recent Gallup poll, Americans named dissatisfaction with government as the #1 problem facing the country today. Americans now believe our government is more of a problem than the economy, education, and terrorism. To change the way our elected officials work for the American people, we must change how they are elected. We need to start with the first round of voting, the primaries. Thanks to gerrymandering and other factors, the primary election is often the only election that matters. In many states, less than 5% of the electorate are actually deciding who represents 100% of that district or state. That means our elected officials are actually chosen by an increasingly tiny, often incredibly partisan slice of the electorate. Today, 42% of Americans identify themselves as independents. Most states exclude independent voters from voting in the first round, the primaries. And in states that do allow them to vote in primaries, they are forced to temporarily join a party that they don't believe in. A top 2 nonpartisan primary eliminates party control in favor of a single nonpartisan primary open to all voters and all candidates. There is no longer a Democratic primary and a Republican primary. There is one primary open to all voters and all candidates. The top 2 vote-getters, regardless of party, then move forward to the general election. With nonpartisan primaries, everyone gets to vote. The winners are more accountable because they have to speak to all the voters in order to get elected. Elections are more competitive. Legislators are encouraged to work across party lines and focus on issues we care about. Top 2 nonpartisan primaries are now used in California, Nebraska, and Washington. You've probably already voted using Top 2. Most municipal elections nationwide use this simple, nonpartisan system. Today, activists in all 50 states are working to bring this crucial system change to their state. The movement is growing. Join us and help us create a government that truly is by and for the people.
Today's economy. Materials are extracted, products manufactured, used and thrown away at as low a cost as possible. This cycle is not only polluting, it is unsustainable in a planet with limited resources. But it can be improved. Have you heard about the circular economy? Products stay in the economy for longer, and at the end of their life, they are reused, repaired, remanufactured, upgraded, or recycled. Truly creating a circular economy could give a €1.8 trillion boost to the European economy. That's the same amount as Italy's entire economy. It would also be good for the environment, reducing the damaging extraction of raw materials, improving air quality by reducing incineration, and preventing toxic residues leaking into the soil through landfill waste sites. But what about people? It is estimated that for every 10,000 tons of waste, 1 job can be created if that waste is incinerated, 6 jobs if it is landfilled, 36 if it is recycled, and 296 if it is reused. Examples from all around Europe show that when people and social enterprises are able to get involved in the circular economy, the social, environmental and financial benefits are enjoyed by all. On the 2nd of December 2015, the European Commission published the Circular Economy Package, which places people at a secondary level. The Greens are calling for a better integration of people's interests in the circular economy, such as stronger support for citizens' initiatives and social enterprises and a stronger focus on green job creation. This is why the Greens are calling for 5 things to change in the package. See more at circular-economy-now.eu.
The green economy could easily be the next industrial revolution. I mean, energy is, we all need energy. We do an annual report which studies how much oil is left in the world and demand for oil. And with China, India, South America, Africa even, growing at the rate they're now growing, we think about 4 or 5 years from now the demand for fuel will exceed supply. That could push, prices through the roof. And for that reason, forget global warming for 1 minute, just for that reason alone, we should be hurrying up, saving on energy and creating alternative sources of energy. And I think those people who invest in this sector, hopefully, will get their thanks. And get their just returns.
What nutritional guidelines should we be following? Well, probably the best source of nutritional guidelines are those that are issued by the American Cancer Society or the National Cancer Institute. And the American Cancer Society, for example, offers 4 really basic, simple nutrition guidelines. The first guideline, which in my mind is the most important, is to choose most of the foods that you eat from plant sources. And we can talk more detail about that in a moment. The second guideline is to limit your intake of high-fat foods, particularly from animal sources. The third guideline is to be physically active and achieve a normal, healthy body weight. And the final guideline is to limit consumption of alcoholic beverages if you choose to drink at all.
So, Susan, one of the things we always hear about from the American Cancer Society is this 5-a-day recommendation. Maybe if you could explain to our listening audience what that actually means.
The 5-a-day recommendation is a very simple way of communicating the message to increase consumption of these plant foods. And what 5-a-day means is 5 servings per day of fruits and vegetables in total. And some people misunderstand this guideline, and they may think it's okay if I have 5 glasses of fruit juice a day and I've met my 5-a-day guideline. But the goal is really to choose both fruits and vegetables as part of the 5-a-day guideline, to vary the fruits and vegetables that you eat on a daily basis, and that alone is a very major step forward in terms of reducing your risk for cancer.
All right, so for example, if now this is interesting. If your eyeballs are in the front of your face, you're seeing things. The part of the brain that lights up when you see something is actually back here. All right, so if you actually were watching, like in my class, I'm sure, the PowerPoints are to die for. And so the part of the brain that's activated at that moment is way back there. If I'm giving the speech of a lifetime and my students are like, more, more, I'm like, this is the part of the brain that lights up, for example. I mean, I'm just sort of characterizing it here. Interestingly enough, if that's all you did, you're lecturing, you're giving presentations, that's it. There's a whole bunch of other areas of the brain that does not tend to get activated if all you're really doing is the kind of traditional didactic approach. So now there are other senses, okay? There's other kinds of senses, and if processing was involved, then the signal kind of spreads out further and further. There's classifications of the part of the cortex. There's deeper areas of the brain, by the way, but we're just looking at the surface, which is where the highest cognitive functions are kind of showing up. But you've got vision processing back here. You've got sound processing back here. There's a kind of a giant swath there that will deal with sensory perceptions, dealing with touch. Smells tend to be directly kind of on the undersurface, out of the way. It's a very old part of the cortex underneath there. And yet we only sort of channel stuff into those areas, which seems extremely kind of narrow focused.
I'm Steve Pinker, and I'm a Harvard College professor and John Stone Family Professor here at Harvard in the Department of Psychology. The cognitive revolution, which took place at Harvard, was the start of the modern scientific study of the mind. Because when you study something like the mind, and you like to think that you're a scientist, you're faced with the immediate problem of what do we do with these things called mental contents, thoughts, emotions, images, plans, rules. You can't see them, you can't taste them, you can't feel them. If you're a scientist, you're supposed to be studying things that you can see and measure and manipulate. How do you even begin with a science of mind? Well, the answer that had dominated psychology in the middle part of the 20th century was to just give up all talk of mental contents. This was the school of behaviorism, and it came to take over American psychology until the early 1950s, when a number of scholars with ties to Harvard started to rethink that whole idea. When we talk about how computers work, you can't get around imputing internal states to them. Computers have memories, they have goal states, they execute plans, and if you could do that about a hunk of metal and you're not being unscientific, why should it be unscientific to say those things about a human being? The result was called cognitive science. It included both experimental psychology, people who study other humans in the lab, linguistics, including the famous theories of the linguist Noam Chomsky, who was here at Harvard as in the Society of Fellows, computer science and artificial intelligence, and later neuroscience.
Infinity is a perplexing idea which basically refers to something that grows without bound. No matter what number you might assign to something, infinity will be larger than that number. We make use of infinity in a number of ways in physics. We imagine that space conceivably could go on infinitely far. We imagine that in principle the universe could go on for an infinite amount of time. But in our calculations, if infinity turns up as the answer to something that we could directly measure with a piece of equipment, then we know that our calculation must be wrong. And we have used that as a diagnostic over many decades to tell us if you find infinity popping out of your equations for something you can measure, you better go back. Think about those equations, modify them in some way in order to get a finite answer, as that's the only kind of answer that we could ever directly measure.
Some years ago, a group of academics from different disciplines recognized the necessity of studying conflict as a phenomenon. They were interested in the distinct properties of conflict as it occurred in international relations, national politics, industrial relations, communities, or even in the domestic setting. These academics believed that approaches from different disciplines could be applied to the study of conflict with a view to better understanding its causes, effects, and solutions. As a result, research groups developed, and universities and academic journals began to publish papers on conflict theory, as it came to be called. Unfortunately, many other academics didn't welcome this new discipline. They couldn't reconcile it with traditional scholarly practices because it had both a practical nature and an analytical approach. Nevertheless, the new discipline continued to develop, and the field grew and spread, and conflict theory now has the same prestige as other academic areas of research and study, despite the early criticism it attracted.
The brand is the talent. And let's stick with that sports analogy. The answer is you can spend $450 million on a stadium, but if over a 10-year period the player talent's no good and there are more losses than there are wins, there are going to be a lot more empty seats than there are full ones, right? No matter how good the marketing is and no matter how beautiful the stadium is, the brand is the talent. Benison Biederman again. The leaders of great groups love talent and know where to find it. They revel in the talent of others. Only in the stupid world of business and government do we promote the best accountant to the head of the accounting department, the best salesman to the head of the sales department, the best trainer to the head of the training department. You don't do that in sports, right? The definition of most of our coaches at the professional level is they were second-rate or marginal players who were brilliant students of the game and people. That is, they were good. What are leaders good at doing? Leading. There was a guy when I was a kid, Yale University used to win the NCAA swimming championships year after year after year. And I've never seen this proven, but it sure doesn't surprise me. There was an interesting thing about their coach. He couldn't swim, but he could sure as heck motivate swimmers. And that's the point, isn't it? There's a thing called leadership.
So today we're going to talk about children's literature and the role it plays in society. Throughout history, adults have used the power of stories to entertain and amuse their children. But stories are not used merely to entertain youngsters. They have a significant educational purpose. They serve to teach the moral values of their society. In sociological terms, stories are one of the means by which children are socialized. How does this work in practice? Well, it often makes use of heroes, the characters in the stories who the children will admire and want to be like. The heroes of children's stories, therefore, exemplify the qualities valued by that society. They will typically demonstrate courage in the face of difficulty, honesty, consideration for others, loyalty to their family and friends, a respect for work, and so on. You can see this happening from the fables of ancient societies, through fairy tales and folk tales, right up to modern-day children's stories. For example, the hard-working ant in Aesop's fable is shown to succeed, in comparison with the grasshopper, who spends the summer singing and has nothing to eat when winter comes. Similarly, it is Cinderella, the honest, hard-working sister, who wins the prince rather than her cruel, lazy stepsisters. However, there is still usually something to entertain children, even in the most morally instructive of stories.
We often think of technology and invention and research as being somehow more sophisticated a proposition than nature. But actually, when we think about it, there are lots of really useful concepts that technology can take from the natural world. People are beginning to remember that other organisms on Earth are doing things in a very similar way to what we need to do. And they're looking closely at what we can learn from nature. Take the bright screens on our mobile phones. Now, this brightness, this effect that they've managed to achieve there, came partly as a result of research into the iridescence of the wings of butterflies and the anti-reflective coatings that moths have on their eyes. And it doesn't end there. They're looking at what makes a spider's web so strong, how glowworms produce light with almost zero energy. The list goes on. And this area of research is called biomimicry. That's bio, as in biology or life, and mimicry, copying or imitating. It's a very interesting field of study.
As physicists tried to explain the masses of particles, they found that if they just tried to inject the mass into the mathematical equations in the most straightforward way, just put a parameter for the mass of a particle right into the math didn't work. It gave rise to quantum mechanically inconsistent features. So it was recognized that you needed to have a more subtle way of introducing mass into the equations that would not spoil the fundamental symmetries, but yet would allow the particles to have different masses. You see, fundamentally, the idea is that all particles begin life as being massless. There's a high degree of symmetry associated with that. All of the particles have the same mass, 0. How do you inject mass without spoiling that symmetry, which is vital for the equations to make sense? The Higgs field does that. By immersing everything in this bath, this molasses-like bath, it turns out that the equations allow you to have your cake and eat it. The fundamental symmetries are deeply preserved, and yet the way in which the particles move, experiencing different resistance-like drag force, allows them to have different masses.
Machiavelli lived from 1469 to 1527. The philosopher Bertrand Russell referred to Machiavelli's most well-known book, The Prince, as a gangster's handbook. And while there's no doubt that certain people have read and used it as such, I think that if we put it into the context of when it was written, which was Italy, especially Florence, in the 15th and 16th centuries, it will be easier to judge Machiavelli's reasons for writing it. Now, the Italy of that period was made up of a number of city-states, often at war with each other. Add to that threats from foreign powers, especially France, and it was a very unstable and dangerous situation. Machiavelli loved his home city, Florence, and wanted to protect its culture, history, and above all, independence at all costs. One way to do this was to establish an army of Florentines loyal to the city-state of Florence. Much of Machiavelli's career was taken up with this issue. It must be remembered, though, that he led an active civic life, was deeply into politics, and was an ambassador for Florence. In this way, he got to meet and observe some of the key players of the time, and through this came to understand the nature of power and how to hold on to it. The Prince was an attempt to teach Florence the lessons he had learnt.
We appear to take it as a rule, or as a law of nature, that each species is adapted to the climate of its own home. For example, species from the Arctic, or even a temperate region, could not survive in a tropical climate, nor could a tropical species last long if it found itself at the South Pole. But it is true to say there's too much emphasis placed on the degree of adaptation of species to the climates where they live. We assume that this adaptation, if all species are descended from a single form, must have taken place over millions of years. Yet a large number of plants and animals brought from different countries remain perfectly healthy in their new home. Also, there are several examples of animal species that have extended their range within historical times from warmer to cooler latitudes and the other way round. Rats and mice provide good examples. They have been transported by man to many parts of the world and now have a far wider range than any other rodent, and they can be found living in the cold climate of the Faroe Islands to the north, through the tropical zones to the Falklands in the south. It is possible to see adaptation to any climate as a quality that is part of an inborn flexibility of the physical and mental constitution of most animals. Therefore, the ability to survive in the most different climates by both man and his domestic animals, and the fact that elephants once existed in an ice age while living species live in tropical areas, should not be seen as deviations from the rule, but as examples of this flexibility being brought into action under particular circumstances.
The way it started really is I was doing this type of work in the United States where there are a number of lawyers doing it, and it had not been done in the UK or the rest of Europe before. And I think the reason it started in the United States was that there was a civil rights movement. And in the civil rights movement, lawyers became deeply involved right away, because if you were black and asserted your rights, you were arrested. Then some very foresightful funders saw the environmental movement coming along just behind the civil rights movement in time and said, we need lawyers in the environmental movement as well. As a result, one of the main contributors to the environmental movement in the United States have been all these lawyers. Here, there was no need for a civil rights movement, so the environmental groups became expert campaigners. But law really wasn't part of the deal, and never has been. They've never used law strategically. They wouldn't say they have. They haven't. I came here and went around and interviewed people in environmental groups in the UK, in Brussels, and so on, and was very surprised at the paucity of the use of law. And that's where Kleindorf came from. So bringing the kind of intellectual DNA of work that I had done in the United States into these very different cultures.
Most of what the general public knows about daily life in ancient Rome comes from art, architecture and literature, which tell us more about the elites, especially the goings-on of the emperors. But how much do we know of the lives of ordinary Romans? Did they have a voice? Apart, that is, from what we can gather from graffiti. The usual picture is one of time spent at festivals, baths and typically the games. However, for many Romans, terrible living conditions, poverty, debt and the chance of being sold into slavery at any moment, that is, if they weren't slaves already, left no time or energy for such forms of entertainment, or for any interest in politics for that matter. Indeed, after the death of Augustus, executive power was taken from the elected assemblies of the Roman people. Now it was the emperor's job to look after the people, and his generosity often depended on the mood and behaviour of the people, on how often and how violently they protested and rioted. One example would be Claudius ensuring a steady grain supply, even in winter, after rioters pelted him with stale crusts of bread. There is an anecdote about Hadrian. While touring the provinces, an old lady approached him with a complaint. He made excuses and tried to get away. She said that if he wouldn't give her a hearing, he shouldn't be emperor. She got her hearing. We have briefly looked at some of the problems involved in running a biggish city, like, say, Melbourne, keeping the road and rail systems running, policing, providing food and housing, and so on. In another lecture, I'm going to deal with what we must now call the megalopolis, cities with populations of 10 million or more. However, first I want to go back in history to when the population of cities could be numbered in the thousands rather than the millions. One of the earliest theorists of the city was, of course, Plato, who created an ideal city in his text, The Republic. The population of this city would be around 25 to 30,000 at most. Oddly enough, the same figures were chosen by Leonardo da Vinci for his ideal cities. Now, of these 25 to 30,000 inhabitants, only about 5,000 would be citizens. A reason for this might be that it is the largest number that could be addressed publicly at one time and by one person, and makes a voting system much easier to manage. Also, perhaps the numbers are kept deliberately low because a large population would be harder to control, or because, in practical terms, fewer inhabitants are easier to feed from local supplies without having to depend on outside sources.
Alexis de Tocqueville, as we have noted, appears to have had some appeal to both ends of the political spectrum, left and right, or rather, both have found him to be useful for their purposes in certain circumstances. His rational acceptance of the new forces of democracy brought about by the American and French revolutions made him an icon of left-wing liberals. However, during the Cold War, that is, from the end of World War II until the collapse of communism, he was adopted by some leading thinkers on the right. So there are two sides to his political philosophy and the man himself that we need to look at. Now, I would suggest that de Tocqueville's biography is important here. You must always bear in mind, when reading him, that he was an aristocrat, and one whose family had suffered in the French Revolution. He wasn't your typical aristocrat, because his politics differed from others of his family and social rank. He abandoned the Catholic Church and married beneath his class. Yet he never quite threw off the prejudices of that class. However, and what is important, he did recognize and believe that the tendency of history, which in those days could be traced back to the Middle Ages, was towards the levelling of social ranks and more equal and democratic conditions. The French Revolution had in the end brought Napoleon, whom he hated, but democracy would inevitably come to France. His trip to America was to see democracy in practice, make note of its shortcomings and errors, and then find safeguards against them.
I suppose more and more people are starting to see graffiti as a form of art. Now, there are still many who would beg to differ, and they'd point to the destructive scribblings that we see on our bus shelters and our public buildings. These often take the form of tags, which are fancy scribble-like versions of someone's name or nickname. Tags generally have no aesthetic appeal, and they are the scourge of the high street shopkeeper in many a town. I can certainly see where the shopkeepers and property owners are coming from. But the fact is, graffiti has been around for a very long time indeed. People left their mark on cave walls back in prehistoric times, and it's been found too on ancient monuments in Egypt and Rome. But New York-style graffiti, which is really the forerunner of a lot of the graffiti that's getting done now, New York graffiti took off in the late 1960s. That's when the advent of the spray can allowed the humble tag to evolve into more complex styles. In the mid to late 70s, subway trains became the new forum for graffiti artists to display their skills. For many young people, it became a medium to express their disillusionment with a system from which they felt excluded. Now, of course, the art establishment embraces graffiti artists, and some of these artists have actually taken on cult status.
I've been asked to speak today about the purpose of museums, and I think that's something we often take for granted, that we have museums and we need museums. But with so much information available now online, people have access to whatever it is they want to know, so I think we need to consider carefully just what it is that we expect of our museums today, what makes them relevant in the information age. Clearly, we've got to move beyond the early 20th century concept of a warehouse full of old, remarkable, untouchable objects. This warehouse idea does very little to inspire people. What museum professionals need to do, what they should be doing, is make their collections and programs work towards the purpose of education. So whether that means having more hands-on exhibits, becoming involved with other community organisations, they should be doing whatever it takes to think about their visitors, to engage people, to educate them. And in that way, they can be instruments of social change. If they have knowledge and understanding of the people who visit, and the people they want to come and visit, they can take this as a starting point for providing exhibitions and services that are relevant to people's lives.
Tissue engineering, what is it? It's an emerging field, interdisciplinary field, that combines engineering and life sciences to create functional biological structures that can restore and improve tissue function. Examples include bladders, trachea, and blood vessels. And if you look at it, printing as a technology has also gone through a revolution. while it's been around for hundreds of years, in the last couple decades, it's gained a new dimension. We can now print layer by layer in materials ranging from plastic to metal to concrete to chocolate, from the smallest scales to the largest. If we take 3D printing and we combine it with biology, we have bioprinting, where the building blocks are cell aggregates, what we call bioink particles, that are composed of thousands of cells that can fuse together into different shapes. These geometries can include multi-layered sheets, such as skin, branching tubes for vasculature, and the sophistication of this manufacturing technology improves daily to include different cell types and different shapes. Now, why is this important? Well, the pharmaceutical industry is in a moment of crisis. It spends more money each year on R&D, but has fewer drugs to show for it. It takes more than a decade, more than $1 billion to develop a new drug, and the cost of failure can be measured in hundreds of millions of dollars.
I want to explore certain issues with you. There is no conclusion to my talk. There is no closure. I think over time, throughout history, cities have changed in whether they were strategic spaces or routinized spaces. They're not always strategic. This, our global modernity, is a time when cities are strategic. That doesn't mean all cities, but that means that certain cities, but throughout the world, become spaces where our most acute problems, our major governance challenges, hit the ground, become concrete, become urgent. The city, urban space, has a capacity to pull down a lot of stuff that otherwise stays up there. Take the environmental question. National states can talk and talk and talk for years. Kyoto took years. But in the meantime, cities had to deal with the environmental question.
When this dog approaches some food, another dog's playful snarls are played back. The dog seems curious, but the sound doesn't stop it from taking the bone. Here, a dog hears the growls of a dog being approached by a stranger. But these don't deter it from grabbing the bone either. In another scenario, the sound of a dog protecting its food is played back. This time, the dog backs off. These experiments suggest that dogs can distinguish between different types of growls.
The Skoog is a new universally accessible musical instrument. It's designed for use by children or adults with special needs, or in fact for use by anyone. It's soft, it's easy to play, it's robust, and it can be customized to suit anyone's abilities. The Skoog helps children with special needs by allowing them to get involved in making music themselves. It's an instrument that they can play and they can take ownership of and start creating their own sounds and music. Traditionally, instruments are the shape and size and made of the materials they are because of the sound that they need to make. If you want something to sound like a plucked string, you need a string and it needs to be under tension. Whereas with the Skoog, because it's a mixture of software and a sensor, then the computer can handle making the sound, and so we can design an object that's designed to be touched and designed to be played with. In developing the Skoog and actually working with kids in the schools and in the classroom, it's really helped us make the Skoog something that's usable by the children themselves. They've informed us massively on how it needs to work, and they've given their opinion on colours and design, and just the feedback that they've given to us has been just marvellous. It's just so enriching, and it's really inspiring to actually work with these kids, particularly when you can provide them with an ability to start playing their own music as opposed to just taking part through listening and listening to other musicians and really learning from them.
Indeed, the library. We've all been to a historic library. We've all enjoyed the smell of a historic library. But what is it and what does it mean? when at UCL Center for Sustainable Heritage, we've recently been asked to assess the environment at another historic library at St. Paul's Cathedral, the Wren Library, an incredible place. And it has such an intensive smell of old books. And we were also asked, for the first time really, I was actually quite taken aback by the brief, we were asked, whatever you do, please preserve the smell. It's so important to our audience. It's so important how people perceive the library. So that was quite an important message in our research. And indeed, smell is an important way of how we communicate with the environment. This piece of research was done by an advertising company, because advertisers are so interested in how we interact with each other and the environment. And we see that the majority of people use sight, obviously, to interact with the environment. But on the second place, we see that smell is also very, very important.
For better or worse, we live in a world profoundly affected by Sigmund Freud. If I had to ask you, name a famous psychologist, the answer, most of you, would be Freud. He's the most famous psychologist ever, and he's had a profound influence on the 20th and 21st century. Some biographical information: he was born in the 1850s. He spent most of his life in Vienna, Austria. But he died in London, and he escaped to London soon after retreating there at the beginning of World War II, as the Nazis began to occupy where he lived. He's one of the most famous scholars ever, but he's not known for any single discovery. Instead, he's known for the development of an encompassing theory of mind, one that he developed over the span of many decades. He was, in his time, extremely well known, a celebrity, recognized on the street. And throughout his life, he was a man of extraordinary energy and productivity, in part because he was a very serious cocaine addict, but also just in general, he was just a high-energy sort of person.
Well, it's about whether you can achieve a win-win solution, whether you can achieve economic growth, which brings wealth, in order to cut poverty without damaging biodiversity. And the argument is that if you want to protect biodiversity, you have to focus on that as a goal. But if you do that, you run the risk of hurting the poor, and you also run the risk of inconveniencing or reducing economic growth. And we're used in developed countries, industrialized countries, to seeing this argument, this axis argued about, with, let us say, a government wishing to start drilling for oil in place X, which is full of wildlife, and the wildlife conservation societies urging them not to, on the grounds that it's a wilderness refuge. We're used to that debate. What I'm saying is that in the developing world, there's a third axis, and it's quite a complex one.
I marvelled at how often powerful feel powerless. But in the face of this sense of disempowerment, there's no decline in involvement in organisations which seek to share wealth and opportunities, which seek to protect one another's rights and work towards the common good. According to the UN, civil society groups have grown 40-fold since the turn of the last century. Last century. Internationally, the non-profit sector is worth $1 trillion. There are 700,000 not-for-profit organisations in Australia alone. 700,000. The UN recognises 37,000 specifically civil society organisations across the globe working in international relief and gives accreditation to many of them. This profound movement towards harnessing voices and resources from outside the realm of governments and officialdom reflects a growth in trust. The third sector, NGOs. Putnam, who discovered in the field of local government in Italy, the best predictor of governmental success was the strength and density of a region's civic associations.
And this illustration often used is the one of the monkeys at the typewriter.
Okay, so we have a monkey sitting at a typewriter, and the claim here is, basically, if you leave chance and time long enough, you will get life, don't worry about it. Yes, it's strange, yes, it's wonderful, but leave enough matter, 600 million years on Earth, and you will have life. So, the monkey's sitting at the typewriter, and the chances are, eventually, he produces the complete works of Shakespeare, so what's the problem? But he doesn't manage to do it in 600 million years. So what I decided to do to run the numbers is instead of saying type the complete works of Shakespeare, I just ran the numbers for how long would it take a monkey typing at 1 keystroke a second to type to be or not to be, that is the question. Right? On average, how long is it going to take my monkey friend at 1 keystroke a second? I don't know how long you think that would be. Maybe you could have a guess. Would it be less or more than 600 million years, which is the period life on Earth is supposed to have emerged within? And when I ran the numbers, to be or not to be, that is the question, takes 12.6 trillion years to type just that phrase. And a DNA string, that complexity emerged by chance, undirected, within 600 million years. Again, it's mathematically possible, but it's so incredibly unlikely that it would have, that it tilts me in favor of the Christian story in which God creating life is simply a question of saying, let there be, and there was.
This simulation shows what you might see if you were orbiting a black hole. The light and position of background stars around the hole are distorted by its gravity, and they seem to spin around. On the right, the constellation Orion appears to approach the event horizon, the boundary from which nothing can escape. Orion's stars look like they become separated and get spun around. Once the hole has passed by, Orion reappears on the left and looks normal again. Users can also experiment with different scenarios. This is what you might see if you were travelling towards a black hole, with rocket engines slowing your descent. Another simulation mimics freefall into a hole. In the middle, the light of the entire universe appears to be concentrated in a bright ring.
A wind turbine is a device that will convert wind into mechanical movement, which we can use to power a water pump or electricity generator. Now, the power that a turbine creates is obviously dependent on the wind speed, but it's also dependent obviously on the number of sails, the area of the sails, and the angle that the sails makes to the wind. So if you can imagine, if the turbine blades are flat onto the wind is just going to sort of bend it. But if they're at a slight angle, when the wind hits it, it's going to turn the blades, and we can use that for powering things. Now, we're going to have a go at making some very, very simple paper windmills, the sort of things that you can make from the bits and pieces lying around at home, and use that to drive a very small generator to power electronic devices.
I'm 43 years old, and I owe tens of thousands of dollars in student loans. Oh, sure, I knew the loans were piling up as I went through school. But with one loan coming from here, another from there, I had no idea of the rock slide that was building. 15 years later, I still experience moments of sheer horror regarding my family's financial situation. My monthly student loan payment is more than triple my car payment. Okay, so without my college degree, I would not have been able to get my current job. For that, I'm grateful, but at what cost? My loans have been accruing at a rate of 10%, and now they have burgeoned to, well, I'm an English major, you do the math. I don't think they'll ever get paid off. We're in debt way past our eyeballs, and there's no hope in sight. I'm being kept in class, a financial class of graduates whose only hope for attending college meant borrowing money from the government. Because of our mounting credit card debt and monthly payments that far exceed our family's income, my kids will also join the class of citizens who can't rely on their parents for college support. Do I wish I'd chosen another educational route? You bet.
The brain is basically built from the bottom up. First, the brain builds basic circuits that are responsible for basic skills, and then more complex circuits are built on top of those basic circuits as we develop more complex skills. Biologically, the brain is prepared to be shaped by experience. It's expecting the experiences that a young child has to literally influence the formation of its circuitry. It's built into our biology. The interaction between genetics and experience that shapes brain architecture is embedded in the reciprocal relationships that children have with the adults in their lives. And by that we mean what we refer to as the serve and return nature of children's interaction with their adults. Development and the impact of experience on development is not a one-way street. It's a back and forth interaction. The brain is a highly integrated organ which has multiple sections that specialize in different kind of processes. So we have parts of the brain that are involved more in cognitive function and other parts that are involved in processing of emotion and parts involved in seeing and hearing. So if a child is emotionally kind of well put together and socially competent, that will affect more positive and productive learning. And if a child is preoccupied with fears or anxiety or is dealing with considerable stress, no matter how intellectually gifted that child might be, his or her learning is going to be impaired by that kind of emotional interference.
Today, 150,000 farmers in India have committed suicide in areas where seed has been destroyed, where they have to buy the seed from Monsanto and buy it every year at very, very high cost. And that high cost seed is getting them into debt, and that debt is pushing them to suicide. What we've done is create community seed banks, places where we collect and save seeds, rescue them from disappearance, multiply them, and then distribute them according to farmers' needs. And about 40 community seed banks have been created across the length and breadth of India. Places where these have been created, farmers are not in distress, because the biggest cost today is seeds and chemicals. These seed banks have now been a new place where we can respond to the new crisis of globalization on the one hand and climate change on the other. Globalization has led to farmer suicides. We are able to take seeds to these suicide zones and distribute the seeds so that farmers can break out of that dependency, grow food crops, get out of debt. We've been able to create community seed banks to deal with climate change, with the extreme flooding, the new droughts, the cyclones, the hurricanes that lead to salinization. And today for us, the work on seed has become the place from where we are responding to the worst tragedies and the worst crises of our time.
Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary, was the first person in the United States identified as an asymptomatic carrier of the pathogen associated with typhoid fever. She was presumed to have infected 51 people, 3 of whom died over the course of her career as a cook. She was twice forcibly isolated by public health authorities and died after a total of nearly 3 decades in isolation. From 1900 to 1907, Mallon worked as a cook in the New York City area for 7 families. In 1900, she worked in Mamaroneck, New York, where, within 2 weeks of her employment, residents developed typhoid fever. In 1901, she moved to Manhattan, where members of the family for whom she worked developed fevers and diarrhea, and the laundress died. Mallon then went to work for a lawyer. She left after 7 of the 8 people in that household became ill. In 1906, she took a position in Oyster Bay, Long Island, and within 2 weeks, 10 of the 11 family members were hospitalized with typhoid. She changed jobs again, and similar occurrences happened in 3 more households. She worked as a cook for the family of a wealthy New York banker, Charles Henry Warren. When the Warrens rented a house in Oyster Bay for the summer of 1906, Mallon went along too. From August 27th to September 3rd, 6 of the 11 people in the family came down with typhoid fever. The disease at the time was unusual in Oyster Bay, according to 3 medical doctors who practiced there.
Now, I like the history, and one thing I want to go over briefly is the history of epigenetic research, and this is from my perspective now. I got into this field in the early 90s, And what I have here is plotted publications, total publications, as a function of time, year, and on a linear graph. So what I did for this is I wanted to show that basically up until around the year 2000, there's an inflection point right around 2005, right in here, where it looks like basically nothing really is happening much in the field of epigenetics, to the point where it's actually going vertical and a lot is happening in the field of epigenetics. Now, if you plot this rather than on linear paper, semi-log paper, what you will find is that what I'm showing is an exponential growth curve for publications in the field of epigenetics. And that in the scientific community, there's a doubling of the epigenetics papers every 1.5 to 2 years. Last year alone, we put into publication somewhere between 15 and 20,000 papers, which took us 15 years from 1990 to 2005.
Advertisers spent over $100 billion worldwide in 2000, and consumer product advertisements accounted for a little under half of that. What did they get for it? Does advertising actually work? Does it, that is, persuade customers to pay a premium price for the extra intangible value which a brand confers on a product? Some businessmen say that one cannot quantify the effect of advertising because it's meant to have an unquantifiable effect, such as improving product awareness, reinforcing brand loyalties, or increasing total consumption of a product category. However, that hasn't stopped advertising executives from trying for many years to prove to clients that advertisements have a very quantifiable effect indeed on sales. Advertising is, of course, only a part of the total marketing mix. Thinking up the product or service, naming it, deciding its price, getting it to retailers, arranging the shelf display are all important too. Advertising was very successful in American Britain during the 1950s and early 1960s. It slowed down in the early 1970s and totally collapsed in the recession of 1974-1975. With the economic recovery from 1976 through 1979 came some improvement, but higher media prices pushed up total expenditures. By 1990, that expenditure in most places had regained its real pre-1974 level. The 1990s were not good, though. Although spending on advertising grew slowly in France, Britain and Japan, only in Germany and America did it increase significantly in real terms. And that was mainly because of the 1996 Olympics, the American elections, and export drives in Japan and Germany.
The key to forming strong brain architecture is what's known as serve and return interaction with adults. In this developmental game, new neural connections form in the brain as young children instinctively serve through babbling, facial expressions, and gestures. And adults return the serve, responding in a very directed, meaningful way. It starts very early in life, when a baby coos and the adult interacts and directs the baby's attention to a face or hand. This interaction forms the foundation of brain architecture upon which all future development will be built. It helps create neural connections between all the different areas of the brain, building the emotional and cognitive skills children need in life. For example, here's how it works for literacy and language skills. When the baby sees an object, the adult says its name. This makes connections in the baby's brain between particular sounds and their corresponding objects. Later, adults show young children that those objects and sounds can also be represented by marks on a page. With continued support from adults, children then learn how to decipher writing and eventually to write themselves. Each stage builds on what came before. Ensuring that children have adult caregivers who consistently engage in serve and return interaction, beginning in infancy, builds a foundation in the brain for all the learning, behavior, and health that follow.
This is a bomb calorimeter. This is the actual piece of equipment that researchers use to calculate the energy content of either biodiesel or maybe even the potato chips that you had for lunch today. When they calculate the amount of energy, they're going to calculate it in heat units, which would either be joules or calories. I want you to look inside the bomb calorimeter. Inside here, you can see that there's a silver bucket. Water goes all in here. And this is actually the bomb. It's a smaller silver cylinder. What you do is put your fuel sample in there. Then these two electrodes are connected to the bomb. These provide the spark that will ignite your sample. When your sample burns or combusts, that gives off energy. So how is the energy collected, or how does a scientist figure out how much energy is being given off? Well, it's a closed system. There's a lid here that goes on top of this calorimeter. And what's in here in the lid is a stirrer. The stirrer is going to stir the water that's in this big pool here, so that the heat given off from the sample is going to warm the water in a uniform way. This is the temperature probe. This goes down in the water also and measures the change in temperature, because as the sample is burned, it'll give off heat and the temperature of the water will increase. So the lid goes on, the sample is prepared. The last thing that you need to make a combustion reaction happen is oxygen. And at some point during the process, some oxygen is added by a tank that's connected to the calorimeter here. So we are going to burn a sample of the biodiesel that you've prepared and get some feedback on the energy content of it. You'll be able to use this to compare it to petroleum-based fuels like octane.
Mars is fourth planet from the Sun and the second smallest planet in the solar system after Mercury, named after the Roman god of war. It is often referred to as a red planet because the iron oxide prevalent on its surface gives it a reddish appearance. Mars is a terrestrial planet with a thin atmosphere, having surface features reminiscent both of the inner crater of the Moon and the volcanoes, valleys, deserts, and polar ice caps of the Earth. The rotational period and the seasonal cycles of the Mars are likewise similar to those of Earth, as it was the tilt that produces the seasons. Mars is the site of the Olympus Mons, the largest volcano and the second largest known mountain in the solar system, and the Valles Marineris, one of the largest canyons in the solar system. Until the first successful Mars flyby in 1965 by Mariner 4, many speculated about the presence of liquid water on the planet's surface. This was based on observed periodic variation in the light and dark patches, particularly in the polar latitude, which appeared to be seas and continents. Geological evidence gathered by the unmanned mission suggested that Mars once had large scale of water coverage on the surface on some earlier stages of existence.
Under appropriate conditions, mind you. Sound receptors. You've got sound receptors in your ear, and they're beautiful. We're not going to talk about them at any length, but there's little flappy, these little spiky things going along in your ear, and they can translate vibrational energy coming from your ear, hitting your eardrum, being translated into a vibration in the fluid in your ear, into a physical motion of these little receptors there, into an electrical motion, into an electrical signal that goes into your ear. So all that's pretty impressive stuff. We're not going to talk about the details of it, but I invite some of you who want to learn more about this, particularly MIT students, I think, find receptors to be really quite remarkable kinds of devices.
The way a mother rat takes care of its pups is by licking and grooming, nipple switching, and archback nursing. So the rats that do a lot of licking and grooming, and there are rats that do very little, but most rats are in between. So that resembles human behavior as well, right? You have mothers that are highly mothering and mothers that couldn't care less, and most mothers are somewhere in between. So if you look at these rats, so all you do, you observe them and you put them in separate cages. So you put the high lickers in one cage, not the mothers, but the offspring, and the low lickers in another cage. And then you let them grow, and they're adults now. Their mothers are long buried, and you look in the brain and you see that those who had high licking mothers express a lot of glucocorticoid receptor gene, and those who are low lickers express very little. That reflects a number of receptors, and that results in a different stress response. But this is not the only difference. We found later on there are hundreds of genes that are differently expressed. So if you get a mutation, a polymorphism once in a million, here just the motherly love changes hundreds of genes in one shot. And it changes them in a very stable way that you can look at the old rat and you can say whether it was licked or not. But you can also say it by behavior. So if you walk to the cages, to the room, the rats that were poorly licked are highly anxious, hard to handle, aggressive. And the rats that were very well handled as little pups, they are much more relaxed, much easier to handle. So, like every technician in the lab knows, looking at the adult rat, how it was licked when it was a little pup. And the question, of course, is mechanism. How does this work?
Sea creatures are inspiring the latest devices that harness wave power. This one, called the oyster, sits on the ocean floor and opens and closes as waves pass over it. Cables attach it to generators on the shore. Since November 2009, it's been powering 9,000 homes in the Orkney Islands. Another device looks like a snake. The anaconda is made from a rubber tube filled with water that floats just below the surface. When a swell hits the front of it, the tube is squeezed. A bulge ripples down its length and powers a turbine in its tail. Prototypes are currently being tested, but the full-scale version will be 200 meters long. This system also looks like a snake, but this one is made of steel. It floats near the surface, where waves make its joints move. This drives hydraulic systems that power electrical generators. Like the anaconda, it's still being tested. Results will prove if these devices are up to the job of supplying viable sources of green energy.
I had been writing nonfiction for years, actually, but secretly wanting to be a novelist. When I first started writing at the age of 30, it was with the intention of writing fiction. But I took a little detour for 10 or 12 years and wrote nonfiction, which I have absolutely no regret about at all. I think it was exactly the right thing for me to do. But there was that dream tucked away inside of me to do this. And I remember reading something that Eudora Welty wrote, who is, the great novelist from Mississippi who had a big influence on me, actually. She said, "No art ever came out of not risking your neck." And I think she's absolutely right about that. It felt that way to me at the time, and actually it feels that way to me every time I sit down to write something. Finally, in the early 90s, I took my deep breath and started writing fiction. It felt risky to me at the time to do that. And one of the very first things that I wrote was what I thought was going to be the first chapter of a novel called The Secret Life of Bees. I wrote it in 1992, and it is actually essentially the first chapter of the novel, as it is.
This is the first ocean deployment of 2 new high-precision instruments designed to monitor the Earth's signals from the seafloor. This housing contains the tiltmeter and nanobottom pressure recorder, and the associated electronics and cabling used for power and communications. The instruments were deployed on the seafloor by a remotely operated vehicle as part of the Mars Seafloor Observatory testbed located at a depth of 3,000 feet in Monterey Bay. In this first test deployment in the ocean, they have already detected the ground motion from several large earthquakes, as far from the Mars site as Chile and the Mariana Trench. In the future, the instruments will be part of a global network of cabled seafloor observatories. Because of their precision, these two new instruments are already detecting signals which could never be measured before.
Today, I want to talk about an important aspect of education, which is the education expenditure of the UK, compared with other European countries. Based on a recent paper published in The Economist Journal, UK is among the bottom 5 countries with the least funding for education sector, and it has only spent 1% of its total GDP on tertiary education, which is insufficient and lower than the OECD countries' average line 4.6%. For instance, the expenditure of Spain is close to the UK in some cases in 2007, and this survey conducted among 50 major cities around the country. However, Denmark and Finland spend much more than the other European countries. So if we decide to compare the education expenditure of the UK with various developing countries, we will find mind-boggling figures.
A painter hangs his or her finished picture on a wall, and everyone can see it. A composer writes a work, but no one can hear it until it is performed. Professional singers and players have great responsibilities, but the composer is utterly dependent on them. A student of music needs as long and as arduous a training to become a performer as a medical student needs to become a doctor. Most training is concerned with technique, for musicians have to have the muscular proficiency of an athlete or a ballet dancer. Singers practice breathing every day, as their vocal cords would be inadequate without controlled muscular support. String players practice moving the fingers of the left hand up and down while drawing the bow to and fro with the right arm, two entirely different movements. Singers and instrumentalists have to be able to get every note perfectly in tune. Pianists are spared this particular anxiety, for the notes are already there waiting for them, and it is the piano tuner's responsibility to tune the instrument for them. But they have their own difficulties. The hammers that hit the strings have to be coaxed not to sound like percussion, and each overlapping tone has to sound clear. This problem of getting clear texture is one that confronts student conductors. They have to learn to know every note of the music and how it should sound, and they have to aim at controlling these sounds with fanatical but selfless authority. Technique is of no use unless it is combined with musical knowledge and understanding. Great artists are those who are so thoroughly at home in the language of music that they can enjoy performing works written in any century.
It is commonly believed in the United States that school is where people go to get an education. Nevertheless, it has been said that today children interrupt their education to go to school. The distinction between schooling and education implied by this remark is important. Education is much more open-ended and all-inclusive than schooling. Education knows no bounds. It can take place anywhere, whether in the shower or in the job, whether in the kitchen or on a tractor. It includes both the formal learning that takes place in schools and the whole universe of informal learning. The agents of education can range from a revered grandparent to the people debating politics on the radio, from a child to a distinguished scientist. Whereas schooling has a certain predictability, education quite often produces surprises. A chance conversation with a stranger may lead a person to discover how little is known of other religions. People are engaged in education from infancy on. Education, then, is a very broad, inclusive term. It is a lifelong process, a process that starts long before the start of school, and one that should be an integral part of one's entire life. Schooling, on the other hand, is a specific, formalized process whose general pattern varies little from one setting to the next. Throughout the country, children arrive at school at approximately the same time, take assigned seats, are taught by an adult, use similar textbooks, do homework, take exams, and so on. The slices of reality that are to be learned, whether they are the alphabet or an understanding of the workings of government, have usually been limited by the boundaries of the subject being taught. For example, high school students know that they are not likely to find out in their classes the truth about political problems in their communities or what the newest filmmakers are experimenting with. There are definite conditions surrounding the formalized process of schooling. Television, The most pervasive and persuasive of modern technologies, marked by rapid change and growth, is moving into a new era, an era of extraordinary sophistication and versatility, which promises to reshape our lives and our world. It is an electronic revolution of sorts, made possible by the marriage of television and computer technologies. The word television, derived from its Greek and Latin roots, can literally be interpreted as sight from a distance. Very simply put, it works in this way. Through a sophisticated system of electronics, television provides the capability of converting an image into electronic impulses, which can be sent through a wire or cable. These impulses, when fed into a receiver, can then be electronically reconstituted into that same image. Television is more than just an electronic system, however. It is a means of expression, as well as a vehicle for communication, and as such becomes a powerful tool for reaching other human beings. The field of television can be divided into two categories determined by its means of transmission. First, there is broadcast television, which reaches the masses through broad-based airwave transmission of television signals. Second, there is non-broadcast television, which provides for the needs of individuals or specific interest groups through controlled transmission techniques. Traditionally, television has been a medium of the masses. We are most familiar with broadcast television because it has been with us for about 37 years in a form similar to what exists today. During those years, it has been controlled for the most part by the broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, who have been the major purveyors of news, information, and entertainment. These giants of broadcasting have actually shaped not only television, but our perception of it as well. We have come to look upon the picture tube as a source of entertainment, placing our role in this dynamic medium as a passive viewer. Standard usage includes those words and expressions understood, used, and accepted by a majority of the speakers of a language in any situation regardless of the level of formality. As such, these words and expressions are well defined and listed in standard dictionaries. Colloquialisms, on the other hand, are familiar words and idioms that are understood by almost all speakers of a language and used in informal speech or writing, but not considered appropriate for more formal situations. Almost all idiomatic expressions are colloquial language. Slang, however, refers to words and expressions understood by a large number of speakers but not accepted as good formal usage by the majority. Colloquial expressions and even slang may be found in standard dictionaries but will be so identified. Both colloquial usage and slang are more common in speech than in writing. Colloquial speech often passes into standard speech. Some slang also passes into standard speech, but other slang expressions enjoy momentary popularity followed by obscurity. In some cases, the majority never accepts certain slang phrases, but nevertheless returns them in their collective memories. Every generation seems to require its own set of words to describe familiar objects and events. It has been pointed out by a number of linguists that three cultural conditions are necessary for the creation of a large body of slang expressions. First, the introduction and acceptance of new objects and situations in the society. Second, a diverse population with a large number of subgroups. Third, association among the subgroups and the majority population. Finally, it is worth noting that the terms standard, colloquial, and slang exist only as abstract labels for scholars who study language. Only a tiny number of the speakers of any language will be aware that they are using colloquial or slang expressions. Most speakers of English will, during appropriate situations, select and use all three types of expressions.
Archaeology is a source of history, not just a humble auxiliary discipline. Archaeological data are historical documents in their own right, not mere illustrations to written text. Just as much as any other historian, an archaeologist studies and tries to reconstitute the process that has created the human world in which we live, and us ourselves insofar as we are each creature of our age and social environment. Archaeological data are all changes in the material world resulting from human action, or more succinctly, the fossilized results of human behavior. The sum total of these constitutes what may be called the archaeological record. This record exhibits certain peculiarities and deficiencies, the consequences of which produce a rather superficial contrast between archaeological history and the more familiar kind based upon written records. Not all human behavior fossilizes. The words I utter and you hear as vibrations in the air are certainly human changes in the material world and may be of great historical significance. Yet they leave no sort of trace in the archaeological records unless they are captured by a dictaphone or written down by a clerk. The movement of troops on the battlefield may change the course of history, but this is equally ephemeral from the archaeologist's standpoint. What is perhaps worse, most organic materials are perishable. Everything made of wood, hide, wool, linen, grass, hair, and similar materials will decay and vanish in dust in a few years or centuries, save under very exceptional conditions. In a relatively brief period, the archaeological record is reduced to mere scraps of stone, bone, grass, metal, and earthenware. Still, modern archaeology, by applying appropriate techniques and comparative methods, aided by a few lucky finds from peat bogs, deserts, and frozen soils, is able to fill up a good deal of the gap. In the late 1960s, many people in North America turned their attention to environmental problems, and new steel and glass skyscrapers were widely criticized. Ecologists pointed out that a cluster of tall buildings in a city often overburdens public transportation and parking lot capacities. Skyscrapers are also lavish consumers and wasters of electric power. In one recent year, the addition of 17 million square feet of skyscraper office space in New York City raised the peak daily demand for electricity by 120,000 kilowatts, enough to supply the entire city of Albany, New York, for a day. Glass-walled skyscrapers can be especially wasteful. The heat loss or gain through a wall of half-inch plate glass is more than 10 times that through a typical masonry wall filled with insulation board. To lessen the strain on heating and air conditioning equipment, builders of skyscrapers have begun to use double-glazed panels of glass and reflective glasses coated with silver or gold mirror films that reduce glare as well as heat gain. However, mirror-walled skyscrapers raise the temperature of the surrounding air and affect neighboring buildings. Skyscrapers put a severe strain on a city's sanitation facilities, too. If fully occupied, the two World Trade Center towers in New York City would alone generate 2.25 million gallons of raw sewage each year, as much as a city the size of Stamford, Connecticut, which has a population of more than 109,000. People appear to be born to compute. The numerical skills of children develop so early and so inexorably that it is easy to imagine an internal clock of mathematical maturity guiding their growth. Not long after learning to walk and talk, they can set the table with impressive accuracy. 1 knife, 1 spoon, 1 fork for each of the 5 chairs. Soon they are capable of noting that they have placed 5 knives, spoons, and forks on the table, and a bit later that this amounts to 15 pieces of silverware. Having first mastered addition, they move on to subtraction. It seems almost reasonable to expect that if a child were secluded on a desert island at birth and retrieved 7 years later, he or she could enter a second-grade mathematics class without any serious problems of intellectual adjustment. Of course, the truth is not so simple. This century, the work of cognitive psychologists has illuminated the subtle forms of daily learning on which intellectual progress depends. Children were observed as they solely grasped or, as the case might be, bumped into concepts that adults take for granted, as they refused, for instance, to concede that quantity is unchanged as water pours from a short, stout glass into a tall, thin one. Psychologists have since demonstrated that young children asked to count the pencils in a pile readily report the number of blue or red pencils, but must be coaxed into finding the total. Such studies have suggested that the rudiments of mathematics are mastered gradually and with effort. They have also suggested that the very concept of abstract numbers, the idea of a oneness, a two-ness, a three-ness that applies to any class of objects and is a prerequisite for doing anything more mathematically demanding than setting a table, is itself far from innate. British Columbia is the third largest Canadian province, both in area and population. It is nearly 1.5 times as large as Texas and extends 100 miles north from the United States border. It includes Canada's entire west coast and the islands just off the coast. Most of British Columbia is mountainous, with long rugged ranges running north and south. Even the coastal islands are the remains of a mountain range that existed thousands of years ago. During the last ice age, this range was scored by glaciers until most of it was beneath the sea. Its peaks now show as islands scattered along the coast. The southwestern coastal region has a humid, mild marine climate. Sea winds that blow inland from the west are warmed by a current of warm water that flows through the Pacific Ocean. As a result, winter temperatures average above freezing and summers are mild. These warm western winds also carry moisture from the ocean. Inland from the coast, the winds from the Pacific meet the mountain barriers of the coastal ranges and the Rocky Mountains. As they rise to cross the mountains, the winds are cooled and their moisture begins to fall as rain. On some of the western slopes, almost 200 inches of rainfall each year. More than half of British Columbia is heavily forested. On mountain slopes that receive plentiful rainfall, huge Douglas firs rise in towering columns. These forest giants often grow to be as much as 300 feet tall, with diameters up to 10 feet. More lumber is produced from these trees than from any other kind of tree in North America. Hemlock, red cedar, and balsam fir are among the other trees found in British Columbia.
Before the 1850s, the United States had a number of small colleges, most of them dating from colonial days. They were small, church-connected institutions whose primary concern was to shape the moral character of their students. Throughout Europe, institutions of higher learning had developed, bearing the Asian name of university. In Germany, a different kind of university had developed. The German university was concerned primarily with creating and spreading knowledge, not morals. Between mid-century and the end of the 1800s, more than 9,000 young Americans, dissatisfied with their training at home, went to Germany for advanced study. Some of them returned to become presidents of venerable colleges, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and transformed them into modern universities. The new presidents broke all ties with the churches and brought in a new kind of faculty. Professors were hired for their knowledge of a subject, not because they were of the proper faith and had a strong arm for disciplining students. The new principle was that a university was to create knowledge as well as pass it on, and this called for a faculty composed of teacher-scholars. Drilling and learning by rote were replaced by the German method of lecturing, in which the professor's own research was presented in class. Graduate training leading to the PhD, an ancient German degree signifying the highest level advanced scholarly attainment, was introduced. With the establishment of the seminar system, graduate students learned to question, analyze, and conduct their own research. At the same time, the new university greatly expanded in size and course offerings, breaking completely out of the old constricted curriculum of mathematics, classics, rhetoric, and music. The president of Harvard pioneered the elective system by which students were able to choose their own courses of study. The notion of major fields of study emerged. The new goal was to make the university relevant to the real pursuits of the world. Paying close heed to the practical needs of society, the new universities trained men and women to work at its tasks, with engineering students being the most characteristic of the new regime. Students were also trained as economists, architects, agriculturalists, social welfare workers, and teachers.
For the last 82 years, Sweden's Nobel Academy has decided who will receive the Nobel Prize in Literature, thereby determining who will be elevated from the great and the near great to the immortal. But today the Academy is coming under heavy criticism, both from the without and from within. Critics contend that the selection of the winners often has less to do with true writing ability than with the peculiar internal politics of the Academy and of Sweden itself. According to Igmar Björksten, the cultural editor for one of the country's two major newspapers, the prize continues to represent what people call a very Swedish exercise reflecting Swedish tastes. The Academy has defended itself against such charges of provincialism in its selection by asserting that its physical distance from the great literary capitals of the world actually serves to protect the Academy from outside influences. This may well be true, but critics respond that this very distance may also be responsible for the Academy's inability to perceive accurately authentic trends in the literary world. Regardless of concerns over the selection process, however, it seems that the prize will continue to survive both as an indicator of the literature that we most highly praise and as an elusive goal that writers seek. If for no other reason, the prize will continue to be desirable for the financial rewards that accompany it. Not only is the cash prize itself considerable, but it also dramatically increases sales of an author's books.
From Boston to Los Angeles, from New York City to Chicago to Dallas, museums are either planning, building, or wrapping up wholesale expansion programs. These programs already have radically altered facades and floor plans or are expected to do so in the not-too-distant future. In New York City alone, 6 major institutions have spread out and out into the airspace and the neighborhoods around them or are preparing to do so. The reasons for this confluence of activity are complex, but one factor is a consideration everywhere: space. With collections expanding, with the needs and functions of museums changing, empty space has become a very precious commodity. Probably nowhere in the country is this more true than at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which has needed additional space for decades and which received its last significant facelift 10 years ago. Because of the space crunch, the Art Museum has become increasingly cautious in considering acquisitions and donations of art, in some cases passing up opportunities to strengthen its collections. De-accessing or selling off works of art has taken on new importance because of the museum's space problems. And increasingly, curators have been forced to juggle gallery space, rotating one masterpiece into public view while another is sent to storage. Despite the clear need for additional gallery and storage space, however, the museum has no plan to break out its envelope in the next 15 years, according to Philadelphia Museum of Art's president. A rare fossil record. The preservation of embryos and juveniles is a rare occurrence in the fossil record. The tiny, delicate skeletons are usually scattered by scavengers or destroyed by weathering before they can be fossilized. Ichthyosaurs had a higher chance of being preserved than did terrestrial creatures because, as marine animals, they tended to live in environments less subject to erosion. Still, their fossilization required a suite of factors: a slow rate of decay of soft tissues, little scavenging by other animals, a lack of swift currents and waves to jumble and carry away small bones, and a fairly rapid burial. Given these factors, some areas have become a treasury of well-preserved ichthyosaur fossils. The deposits at Holzmaden, Germany, present an interesting case for analysis. The ichthyosaur remains are found in black, bituminous marine shells deposited about 190 million years ago. Over the years, thousands of specimens of marine reptiles, fish, and invertebrates have been recovered from these rocks. The quality of preservation is outstanding, but what is even more impressive is the number of ichthyosaur fossils containing preserved embryos. Ichthyosaurs with embryos have been reported from 6 different levels of the shell in a small area around Holzmaden, suggesting that a specific site was used by large numbers of ichthyosaurs repeatedly over time. The embryos are quite advanced in their physical development. Their petals, for example, are already well formed. One specimen is even preserved in the birth canal. In addition, the shell contains the remains of many newborns that are between 20 and 30 inches long. Why are there so many pregnant females and young at Holzmaden when they are so rare elsewhere? The quality of preservation is almost unmatched, and quarry operations have been carried out carefully with an awareness of the value of the fossils. But these factors do not account for the interesting question of how there came to be such a concentration of pregnant ichthyosaurs in a particular place very close to their time of giving birth.
I think one of the things that's confusing for people is when they come here is there appear to be hundreds and hundreds of rules, hundreds of things you should and shouldn't do. And the truth of it is most of them are about class. And lots of them are tripwires, actually, for people who don't know them. So what I tried to do in my book was take it back to some sort of first principle and say, look, there are anthropological reasons why we have certain kinds of manners. So I'll give you a very good example. In Britain, there are sort of two ways of holding a knife very broadly. And broadly speaking, the middle classes hold it with the index finger on the top, gripped in the hand, and working class people hold it like a pen. Entirely a class distinction, and people mercilessly exploit it if they want to. The truth of it is, the one way not to hold a knife at the table is clasped in your fist, raised, as if to kill your guest. And what does that tell us about eating? Well, what it tells us about eating is two things. It's never confuse your guests with either the food or the enemy. Don't eat them and don't kill them. That's about how you should hold your knife, because actually manners are really about the reduction of violence. There's a lot in there about reducing violence. So that's just an illustration of what one tries to do. So actually, when you look at real table manners, they're about people feeling comfortable with each other, sharing food around a table. Very important human thing.
And I think, what's your favourite new word at the moment?
Really, I don't have favourite new words, but let's say that one of my favourite new words is screenager, which is a young person or a teenager who spends a lot of time in front of the computer.
Any other favourites, John?
Some of those rather unpleasant words like splod, somebody who's socially inept, a sploddy person. But as I say, I don't really have favourite words, because all words, as far as I'm concerned, are objects of scientific study.
And where do these new words and phrases come from?
Well, words come out of the culture that they represent and they describe. So if you've got a new development in medicine, for example, bird flu, then you'll get a new word coming out of that. If there's a military conflict, that may well bring all sorts of new words to the fore. Going back in time, the First and Second World Wars were times of great creativity of language, because people from different countries met each other and exchanged their words, and words developed from there. So really words come from the playground, they come from politics, they come from any area of life, because every area of life is changing from day to day.
How do you keep up with the huge weight of new words you must have to evaluate?
Well, it's not just me. We've got something like 60 editors working on the Oxford Dictionary, and we also have readers and word spotters throughout the world who are sending us information in. In the old days, they used to write them out on index cards when they came across them in books, but nowadays they tend to type them onto their computers and send them into the central computer here. It's an enormous issue, but one which we just about manage to keep under control. We don't include words just because we've seen one example of them. We have to wait for evidence of general currency to build up in our computer files before we start putting the word in the dictionary. So a lot of the time it's collecting data, letting it build up, and then reviewing it and seeing what you've got. And so that's how we manage the work.
Ruth, just tell us what the Ethical Consumer Research Association is.
Okay, well, the Ethical Consumer Research Association exists to provide information for shoppers, letting them know what the companies are doing behind the brands that they see on the shelves.
So what makes an ethical shopper?
Very broadly speaking, people who are concerned about ethical issues want to know that the product they're buying hasn't been made at the expense of the people who are producing it, whether it's in this country or abroad. They might also be concerned with other kinds of issues, whether the company is involved in armaments or whether they're donating money to certain political parties, that as a shopper you might not want to give your money to that party, so therefore you might not want to buy a product from a company who is supporting a political party that you don't agree with.
And is there any kind of rule of thumb? I mean, is something that's more expensive, for example, likely to be more ethical?
Unfortunately, it isn't always the case that the more expensive something is, the more ethical it is. We can buy very cheap products, and it's very likely that when products are cheap, something has suffered in order to get it to us, whether it's the person who's been making it, or the animals, or the environment. Quality, however, is often a good indicator of whether something, especially with clothes, has been made well. And unfortunately, a lot of ethical products will cost more because they reflect the real cost of bringing that thing into the shops. So something that has been made in a factory where the workers have been paid a proper wage will cost you more to buy simply because the people who are making it are getting paid enough to live on.
Do you have to be well off then to be an ethical shopper?
It really depends. You don't have to be rich to be an ethical shopper. One way of thinking about ethical shopping is thinking about buying less. Sometimes we buy an awful lot more than we need. We buy more items of clothing than we need. So being an ethical shopper really means thinking a bit before you go and spend your money in the shops. Some things may cost a little bit more in the short run, but be worth it in the long run. If you are paying for quality, something will last you longer and then save you money. And sometimes you can buy things second hand. There's a lot of charity shops on the high street to buy good clothes. Sometimes you can look a lot better than someone who's just bought off the high street because you can have quite a unique look. And the quality that you find in most second hand shops is really very good these days. So it's about thinking before you shop.
Thanks.
Located at the NASA Research Center in Iowa is a 5,000-gallon vat of water, and inside the tank is an underwater treadmill designed by Dava Newman, an aerospace engineer. For 4 years, Newman observed scuba divers as they simulated walking on the Moon and on Mars on her underwater moving belt. She wanted to discover how the gravity of the Moon and of Mars would affect human movement. To do this, Newman attached weights to the divers and then lowered them into the tank and onto the treadmill. These weights were carefully adjusted so that the divers could experience underwater the gravity of the Moon and of Mars as they walked on the treadmill. Newman concluded that walking on Mars will probably be easier than walking on the Moon. The Moon has less gravity than Mars does. So, at lunar gravity, the divers struggled to keep their balance and walked awkwardly. But at Martian gravity, the divers had greater traction and stability and could easily adjust to a pace of 1.5 miles per hour. As Newman gradually increased the speed of the treadmill, the divers took longer, graceful strides until they comfortably settled into an even quicker pace. Newman also noted that at Martian gravity, the divers needed less oxygen. The data Newman collected will help in the future design of Martian spacesuits. Compared to lunar spacesuits, Martian spacesuits will require smaller air tanks, and to allow for freer movement, the elbow and knee areas of the spacesuits will also be altered.
Everyone is interested in improving their diet. Adding grains is one of the easiest ways. Many people in the United States have a growing concern about nutrition, so grains are often served in restaurants. And many grains are now available in grocery stores too. Though for some, you still have to go to health food stores. You can stock up when you go, though, because uncooked grains keep a long time. You'll find that grains are easy to prepare. Many grains are as simple to cook as spaghetti. Barley, for instance, is just cooked in salted water. Remember, though, whole grain barley, the most nutritious kind, never will get as tender as spaghetti, no matter how long it's cooked. Grain-based salads are easy, too. Just use grains left over from a hot meal. You can even put together a grain salad hours before you need it, since grains don't wilt like lettuce does. But to get back to health factors, all grains are nutritious, and many have special benefits. Barley has very little fat. Some experts believe that it may even reduce cholesterol levels. Jasmine rice is also low in fat, and it has a bonus in its wonderful aroma, a very special fragrance.
So, you see, physical illness can have psychological causes. Now, we just have time to introduce another interesting example of the interaction between the mind and the body. Placebos. Placebos, maybe you've heard them called sugar pills, are harmless substances, not always sugar, that are used routinely on groups of sick people in experiments. These experiments test the effectiveness of new drugs. One group is given the new drug, the other group is given a placebo, and the results are measured. As you might guess, some of the people who receive the new drug get better. Surprisingly, however, some of the placebo group also get better. Why? Well, it's an interesting question, one which doctors can't quite answer. Some of the group may have gotten better on their own without any treatment at all. But research has shown that the very act of taking a medication that you think will make you better often does make you feel better. Have you ever taken an aspirin and felt better in 5 minutes? Aspirin doesn't work that fast, does it? Basically, if you believe you will get better, sometimes you do. The history of how doctors and healers have used the mind-body connection to cure people is long and interesting. But I see that it's time to close, so I'll have to cover this in the next class. You'll have to hold your questions on this topic till then. Before you go, I have some handouts for you concerning the midterm exams next week.
As Dr. Miller mentioned, we're trying to recruit volunteers for the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary. But before I get into the details of the volunteer program, I'd just like to tell you a little about what we do there. One of our main jobs is to keep detailed records of the migration patterns of raptors. For those of you who don't know, raptors are birds of prey, like hawks and eagles. Between August and December, we see around 20 different species migrating from Canada and New England. About 20,000 birds. Part of what attracts them to Hawk Mountain is the location on the east ridge of the Appalachian Mountains. What happens is that the sun warms the ridge in such a way that air currents are formed. The birds just sort of glide along on the air, so they use up very little energy. As volunteers, you'll be helping us keep accurate counts of the raptors. Any drop in number could mean something's gone wrong in the environment, because of pesticides or disease, even hunting. We just had a scare with the broad-winged hawks. Their numbers have dropped drastically over the last 10 years. It was suggested that the birds may have changed their migratory route. So for 11 days we had several hundred volunteers stationed every 5 miles to observe and count. And sure enough, they discovered that instead of hugging the Appalachians as they'd always done, the broadwings were cutting a wider path over the Delaware River. Needless to say, we were greatly relieved.
These days, we take for granted the wide variety of music available on the radio. But this wasn't always the case. In the early days of radio, stations were capable of broadcasting only a narrow range of sounds, which was all right for the human voice, but music didn't sound very good. There was also a great deal of crackling and other static noises that further interfered with the quality of the sound. A man named Edwin Armstrong, who was a music lover, set out to change this. He invented FM radio, a technology that allowed stations to send a broad range of frequencies that greatly improved the quality of the music. Now, you'd think that this would have made him a millionaire. It didn't. Radio stations at that time had invested enormous amounts of money in the old technology, so the last thing they wanted was to invest millions more in the new technology. Nor did they want to have to compete with other radio stations that had a superior sound and could put them out of business. So they pressured the Federal Communications Commission, the department of the United States government that regulates radio stations, to put restrictive regulations on FM radio. The result was that its use was limited to a very small area around New England. Of course, as we all know, Edwin Armstrong's FM technology eventually prevailed and was adopted by thousands of stations around the world. But this took years of court battles, and he never saw how it came to affect the lives of almost everyone.
At last month's meeting, you asked me to draw up a report about the possibility of keeping the Student Center open 24 hours a day. I decided that the best way to assess the need for expanded hours was to talk to the people who were still in the Student Center at closing time. First, Over the course of the 2 weeks, I interviewed more than 50 students as they left the Student Center at its regular closing time of 12 midnight. About 80% of them said they would prefer that the center stay open later. Of the 3 main uses of the center, eating in a snack bar, recreation in the game room or watching TV, and studying, by far the most popular late-night activity is, and this may surprise you, studying. Almost all of the people I talked to said that their main reason for being in the center after 10 p.m. was to study in groups or to find a quiet place to study because their dorm was too noisy. Of course, many of these people use the snack bar or TV room for breaks. My recommendation is that we ask the administration to keep the center open after midnight for studying. The recreation room and snack bar can still close at the usual time. This should meet the objection that it costs too much to staff the center from midnight to 8 a.m., which I'm sure will be the first response.
Okay, as you look at this next exhibit, you'll notice something quite common, an ordinary bar of soap. Now, soap has been around a long time. In fact, the ancient Phoenicians produced soap as a substance for washing the body way back in 600 B.C. They made it by blending goat's fat with wood ash. The Phoenicians, as you may know, regularly traded along the Mediterranean, and they were the ones who introduced soap to the Greeks and Romans. Now, soap was not something welcomed by all countries. In fact, during the superstitious Middle Ages, many people were afraid to bathe their whole body too frequently. They thought it could be dangerous for their health, that it could even kill them. And even after the production of soap became common in some European countries in the 11th and 12th centuries, even then some people in the heart of Europe refused to use it. You'll find it interesting that when a duchess was given a box of soap as a present in 1549, she was so insulted that she had the gift-giver thrown off her estate. But by the 19th century, the attitude towards soap had changed drastically. In some regions of Europe, the tax on soap was so high that people secretly made their own. A baron went so far as to suggest that the wealth of a nation could be judged according to the amount of soap it used. Now, if you turn your attention to the next exhibit, you can see how soap is manufactured today.
If you like the colorful animals we just saw, you're going to love these next animals. Frogs. You might not normally think of frogs as being colorful, but these frogs definitely are. They are the dart poison frogs of Central and South America. Look at their striking colors, often yellow with black stripes or deep blue with black spots. Beyond being nice to look at, these markings have a purpose. They warn predators that these frogs are poisonous. When threatened, these frogs secrete a substance through their skin that would easily kill whatever animal might try to eat them. Their bright colors communicate this, and so most animals tend not to hunt them. Now, speaking of hunting, for centuries these frogs were sought after by hunters. As you might think, the hunters didn't want to eat the frogs, but rather they captured them for their poison. They would add the poison to the tips of their hunting arrows. Of course, nowadays, most hunters use guns. These days, dart poison frogs are of less interest to hunters than to medical researchers. Researchers believe that they can make new heart medicine from the poison because it acts as a stimulant on the body's nervous system. Researchers think they could use it to stimulate a weak heart. There is, however, a problem with doing research on these frogs. Those that are caught in the wild will produce their poison until they die. However, those that are born in captivity, like the ones you see here, will not produce any poison at all.
Did you ever wonder why it is that most people are programmed to sleep at night instead of during the day? If there's something about the cycle of light and dark that's telling us when to sleep, then shouldn't the sleep cycle of a blind person be different? As it turns out, many blind people, people with no visual perception of light at all, do have the same sleep cycle as sighted people. So now you're wondering, how can this happen? The answer is hormones. One hormone in particular. It's called melatonin. In sighted people, the level of melatonin goes up at night, or when it's dark, and goes down in the day, or when it's light. It's believed that it's the presence of this hormone in the blood that gives us the urge to sleep. If an increase in melatonin level programs sighted people to sleep at night, then what about blind people? a researcher named Dr. Charles Chesler tells about an interesting experiment. He tried shining a bright light into the eyes of some blind people. When he did this, he noticed that the level of the melatonin in the blood of these subjects went down, just as it would do for sighted people. Somehow, the eyes of these subjects, even though they were damaged and had no visual perception of light, could tell their brain when there was more or less light. Now, this doesn't work for all blind people. In fact, most of Chesler's subjects had no hormonal response to light at all. Further research may be able to explain this sensitivity to light in terms of the type of blindness of the subject.
Welcome to the Four Winds Historical Farm, where traditions of the past are preserved for visitors like you. Today, our master thatchers will begin giving this barn behind me a sturdy thatched roof, able to withstand heavy winds and last up to 100 years. How do they do it? Well, in a nutshell, thatching involves covering the beams or rafters, the wooden skeleton of a roof, with reeds or straw. Our thatchers here have harvested their own natural materials for the job, the bundles of water reeds you see lying over there beside the barn. Thatching is certainly uncommon in the United States today. I guess that's why so many of you have come to see this demonstration. But it wasn't always that way. In the 17th century, the colonists here thatched their roofs with reeds and straw, just as they had done in England. After a while, though, they began to replace the thatch with wooden shingles, because wood was so plentiful, and eventually other roofing materials like stone, slate, and clay tiles came into use. It's a real shame that most people today don't realize how strong and long-lasting a thatched roof is. In Ireland, where thatching is still practiced, the roofs can survive winds of up to 110 miles per hour. That's because straw and reeds are so flexible. They bend but don't break in the wind like other materials can. Another advantage is that the roofs keep the house cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And then, of course, there's the roof's longevity. The average is 60 years, but they can last up to 100. With all these reasons to start thatching roofs again, wouldn't it be wonderful to see this disappearing craft return to popularity?
Today we're going to practice evaluating the main tool used when addressing groups, the voice. There are three main elements that combine to create either a positive or negative experience for listeners. They can result in a voice that is pleasing to listen to and can be used effectively. Or they can create a voice that doesn't hold attention, or even worse, causes an adverse reaction. The three elements are volume, pitch, and pace. When evaluating volume, keep in mind that a good speaker will adjust to the size of both the room and the audience. Of course, with an amplifying device like a microphone, the speaker can use a natural tone. But speakers should not be dependent on microphones. A good speaker can speak loudly without shouting. The second element, pitch, is related to the highness or lowness of the sounds. High pitches are for most people more difficult to listen to, so in general, speakers should use the lower registers of their voice. During a presentation, it's important to vary pitch to some extent in order to maintain interest. The third element, pace, that is how fast or slow words and sounds are articulated, should also be varied. A slower pace can be used to emphasize important points. Note that the time spent not speaking can be meaningful too. Pauses ought to be used to signal transitions or create anticipation. Because a pause gives the listener time to think about what was just said, or even to predict what might come next, it can be very effective when moving from one topic to another. What I'd like you to do now is watch and listen to a videotape, and use the forms I gave you to rate the speaking voices you hear. Then tonight, I want you to go home and read a passage into a tape recorder and evaluate your own voice.
Before we start our first lab, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the workbook we'll be using. The first thing I'd like to point out is that the workbook contains a very large amount of material, far more than you could ever handle in a single semester. What you're supposed to do is choose the experiments and activities that you want to do, within a certain framework, of course. Part of my job is to help you make your choices. Next, I'd like to mention that in each workbook chapter, there are usually 2 subsections. The first is called Experiments, and the second is called Activities. In the Experiments section, the workbook gives full instructions for all the experiments, including alternate procedures. Choose the procedure you wish. There's plenty of equipment available. In the Activities section, you will find suggestions for projects that you can do on your own time. You'll see that there are usually no detailed instructions for the activities. You're supposed to do them your own way. If there are no questions, let's turn to Chapter 1 now.
Word comes from California of a new weapon in the war on household pests. 2 scientists working for a firm in Anaheim, California, have developed a method to eliminate insects without using dangerous chemicals. The new poison? Hot air. The basic idea is that insects cannot adjust to temperatures much above normal. In laboratory experiments, cockroaches and termites can't survive much more than a quarter of an hour at 125 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 50 degrees centigrade. The new method involves covering a house with a huge tent and filling it with air heated to around 65 degrees centigrade. Hot air is forced in with fans, and the tent keeps the heat inside the house. Since termites try to escape by hiding in wooden beams, the heat treatment must be continued for a full 6 hours. But when it's all over and the insects are dead, there are no toxic residues to endanger humans or pets, and no funny smells. Scientists claim that there is no danger of fire either, since very few household materials will burn at 65 degrees centigrade. In fact, wood is prepared for construction use by drying it in ovens at 80 degrees centigrade, which is substantially hotter than the air used in this procedure.
I'm sure you realize that your research papers are due in 6 weeks. I've looked at your proposed topics and made comments about them. The most frequent problem was proposing too broad a topic. Remember, this is only a 15-page paper. As I return your topic papers, I'd like to look over the schedule which sketches out what we'll do during the next 2 weeks. Today is Monday. By Friday, I want your preliminary outline. Please be sure to incorporate the suggestions I've made on your topics in your outlines. Next week, I'll have a conference with each of you. I've posted a schedule on my office door. Sign your name to indicate the time you're available for an appointment. In the conference, we'll discuss your preliminary outline. Then you can make the necessary revisions and hand in your final outline, which is due 2 weeks from today. Use the outline style in your textbook, and remember it should be no more than 2 pages long. Be sure to begin with a thesis statement. That is, with a precise statement of the point you intend to prove, and include a conclusion. Have you got all that? Your 2-page preliminary outlines are due at the end of this week, and the final outlines are due after your conferences. Follow the textbook style and include a thesis statement and a conclusion.
It seems like only yesterday that I was sitting where you are, just finishing my first year of medical school, and wondering if I'd ever get a chance to use all my new knowledge on a real live patient. Well, I have good news for you. You don't have to wait until your 3rd or 4th year of medical school to get some hands-on experience. The dean has invited me here to tell you about the university's Rural Opportunities Program. If you enroll in this program, you can have the opportunity this summer, after your first year of medical school, to spend from 4 to 6 weeks observing and assisting a real physician, like me, in a small rural community. You won't have to compete with other students for time and attention, and you can see what life as a country doctor is really like. The program was designed to encourage medical students like yourselves to consider careers in rural communities that are still understaffed. It seems that medical students are afraid to go into rural family practice for 2 reasons. First, they don't know much about it. And second, specialists in the cities usually make more money. But, on the upside, in rural practice, doctors can really get to know their patients and be respected members of the community. I participated in the program when it first started and spent 6 weeks in a small rural town. Let me tell you, it was really great. I got to work with real patients. I watched the birth of a child, assisted an accident victim, and had lots of really practical hands-on experience, all in one summer. And to my surprise, I found that country life has a lot to offer that city life doesn't. No pollution or traffic jams, for instance. My experience made me want to work where I'm needed and appreciated. I don't miss the city at all.
Current studies show that what goes on labels is an important consideration for manufacturers, since more than 70% of shoppers read food labels when considering whether to buy a product. A recent controversy as to whether labels on prepared foods should educate or merely inform the consumer is over, and a consumer group got its way. The group had maintained that product labels should do more than simply list how many grams of nutrients a food contains. Their contention was that labels should also list the percentage of a day's total nutrients that the product will supply to the consumer, because this information is essential in planning a healthy diet. A government agency disagreed strongly, favoring a label that merely informs the consumer. In other words, a label that only lists the contents of the product. The agency maintained that consumers could decide for themselves if the food is nutritious and is meeting their daily needs. The consumer group, in supporting its case, had cited a survey in which shoppers were shown a food label and were then asked if they would need more or less of a certain nutrient after eating a serving of this product. The shoppers weren't able to answer the questions easily when they were not given a specific percentage. This study and others helped get the new regulation passed, and now food products must have the more detailed labels.
Last week we talked about Anne Bradstreet and the role of women in the Puritan colonies. Today I want to talk about some other women who've contributed to American history, some famous and some not so famous. The first woman I'd like to talk about is Molly Pitcher. Those of you who are familiar with the name may know her as a hero of the American Revolution. But in fact, there never was a woman named Molly Pitcher. Her real name was actually Mary Ludwig Hayes. She got the nickname Molly Pitcher for her acts of bravery during the Revolutionary War. As the story goes, when Mary's, or Molly's husband, John Hayes, enlisted in the artillery, Mary followed, like many other wives did. She helped out doing washing and cooking for the soldiers. She was known to be a pretty unusual woman. She smoked a pipe and chewed tobacco. Anyway, in the summer of 1778, at the Battle of Monmouth, it was a blistering hot day, maybe over 100 degrees, and 50 soldiers died of thirst during the battle. Molly wasn't content to stay back at camp. Instead, she ran through gunshots and cannon fire, carrying water in pitchers from a small stream out to the thirsty American soldiers. The relief that she brought with her pitchers of water gave her the legendary nickname Molly Pitcher. The story also says that she continued to load and fire her husband's cannon after he was wounded. They say she was so well liked by the other soldiers that they called her Sergeant Molly. In fact, legend has it that George Washington himself gave her the special military title.
Today we're going to talk about shyness and discuss recent research on ways to help children learn to interact socially. Many people consider themselves shy. In fact, 40% of the people who took part in our survey said they were shy. That's 2 out of every 5 people. And there are studies to indicate that the tendency toward shyness may be inherited. But just because certain children are timid doesn't mean they are doomed to be shy forever. There are things parents, teachers, and the children themselves can do to overcome this tendency, and even to prevent it. One researcher found that if parents gently push their shy children to try new things, they can help these children become less afraid and less inhibited. Another way to help shy children is to train them in social skills. For example, there are special training groups where children are taught things like looking at other children while talking to them, talking about other people's interests, and even smiling. These groups have been very successful at giving shy children a place to feel safe and accepted, and at building up their self-esteem. Welcome to Yellowstone National Park. Before we begin our nature walk today, I'd like to give you a short history of our National Park Service. The National Park Service began in the late 1800s. A small group of explorers had just completed a month-long exploration of the region that is now Yellowstone. They gathered around a campfire, and after hours of discussion, They decided that they should not claim this land for themselves. They felt it should be accessible to everyone. So they began a campaign to preserve this land for everyone's enjoyment. 2 years later, in the late 19th century, an act of Congress signed by President Ulysses S. Grant proclaimed the Yellowstone region a public park. It was the first national park in the world. After Yellowstone became a public park, many other areas of great scenic importance were set aside, and in 1916 the National Park Service was established to manage these parks. As a park ranger, I am an employee of the National Park Service. In a national park, park rangers are on duty at all times to answer questions and help visitors in any difficulty. Nature walks, guided tours, and campfire talks are offered by specially trained staff members. The Park Service also protects the animals and plants within the parks.
I need to make sure you understand how to get housing for next year. When you entered as first-year students this year, the school assigned you to a dorm and a roommate. But next year, as returning students, you'll choose both your roommate and your dorm. But whether or not you actually get to live in your first choice depends on what number you or your roommate draws in the lottery system. The system gives priority to the students who have been here longest. Fourth-year students get the first block of numbers. Third years get the second block, and second years, like you'll be, get the third. The lower the number you draw, the sooner you choose. Number 1 gets the first choice. Number 2 gets the second choice, and so on. You can use either your own or your intended roommate's number to make your room choice. If your roommate for next year has been at the school longer than you have, they'll be in a better block of numbers, and so will have a better number than any second-year student. But most of you will probably be rooming with other second-year students, and so neither of you may have a great number. You may not get into your first or even second choice. Of course, if you've made plans to live off campus, you don't need to enter the lottery at all. Dorm space will be especially tight this year because the dorms on North Campus will be closed for renovations. This means that those of you who draw the worst numbers won't be able to get dorm housing at all. In that case, the housing office will help you find off-campus housing.
So why did what is now called modern dance begin in the United States? To begin to answer this question, I'll need to backtrack a little bit and talk about classical ballet. By the late 1800s, ballet had lost a lot of its popularity. Most of the ballet dancers who performed in the United States were brought over from Europe. They performed using the rigid techniques that had been passed down through the centuries. Audiences and dancers in the United States were eager for their own contemporary dance form, and so, around 1900, dancers created one. So, how was this modern dance so different from classical ballet? Well, most notably, it wasn't carefully choreographed. Instead, the dance depended on the improvisation and free personal expression of the dancers. Music and scenery were of little importance to the modern dance, and lightness of movement wasn't important either. In fact, modern dancers made no attempt at all to conceal the effort involved in a dance step. But even if improvisation appealed to audiences, many dance critics were less than enthusiastic about the performances. They questioned the artistic integrity of dancers who were not professionally trained and the artistic value of works that had no formal structure. Loie Fuller, after performing Fire Dance, was described as doing little more than turning round and round like an egg beater. Yet the free personal expression of the pioneer dancers is the basis of the controlled freedom of modern dance today. Human populations near the equator have evolved dark skin over many generations because of exposure to the fierce rays of the sun. A similar phenomenon has also occurred in other parts of the animal kingdom. The African grass mouse is a good example. Most mice are nocturnal, but the African grass mouse is active during daylight hours. This means that it spends its days searching for food in the semi-dry bush and scrub habitats of eastern and southern Africa. Its fur is striped like a chipmunk's, which helps it blend in with its environment. Because it spends a lot of time in the intense tropical sun, The grass mouse has also evolved two separate safeguards against the sun's ultraviolet radiation. First, like the populations of humans in this region of the world, the skin of the grass mouse contains lots of melanin, or dark pigment. Second, and quite unusual, this mouse has a layer of melanin-pigmented tissue between its skull and skin. This unique cap provides an extra measure of protection for the grass mouse and three other types of African mouse-like rodents that are active during the day. The only other species scientists have identified with the same sort of skull adaptation is the white tent-making bat of the Central American tropics. Although these bats sleep during the day, they do so curled up with their heads exposed.
We're going to start today talking about congressional aides. That is, the people who work for our congressional representatives, both in Washington and in the representatives' local districts. It used to be that members of Congress had a relatively small staff of people working for them, and the role of these people wasn't of primary importance. But now there are thousands of congressional aides, and they've profoundly affected the way the whole government works. Congressional aides work in two different locations. One in the congressional representatives' local offices, the districts from which they were elected, and two in Washington. Staff in the local offices help members of Congress stay in touch with citizens in their districts. These citizens can bring problems in person or by mail or phone. This personal connection between the aides and the local people can be helpful when the next election comes around. People remember the help they get from the office of their local congressional representative. But as you know, members of Congress have to spend most of their time in Washington taking care of their legislative duties. Over 6,000 new laws are introduced in Congress each session. Without help, representatives would have trouble keeping up with the proposed laws that directly affect their districts. So that's why the congressional aides play a major role in Washington. They keep their bosses informed about pending legislation, organize hearings, and just keep their local congressional representatives up to date and informed on what's going on in other parts of Congress. Now, another thing congressional aides do is to help develop ideas for laws that their bosses can eventually propose to Congress. This can be called the staff's entrepreneurial function, a bit like a business executive trying to find out what products are most popular. Congressional aides promote or encourage laws they think will be popular with the public. You've also got other employees that work for the whole Congress, not just for individual members. We'll talk about these people next. Now, you've been reading articles about the tremendous damage done to life and property by earthquakes. That's why seismologists have been working so hard to develop methods of earthquake prediction. We can now predict earthquakes fairly well, but the predictions only locate potential areas of danger. They don't predict the specific time and location at which an earthquake is likely to occur. Today, I want to introduce to you 3 prediction models that have been developed. The first prediction model looks along earthquake faults, those cracks in the Earth's crust, to find what are known as seismic gaps. Seismic gaps are places where the fault has shown little or no seismic activity for a long time. This theory postulates that such places are due for a major shock. The second model relies on phenomena like ground tilt. Using long cylindrical tubes containing water, observers noted that ground tilt tended to occur before major earthquakes. That led them to correctly predict the Big Hai-Chung quake of 1975, the first successful earthquake prediction scientists have ever made. 1 million people were evacuated from that Chinese city before the earthquake struck. Unfortunately, this method hasn't worked consistently, so we can't say it's been perfected. The third model is based on the theory that major earthquakes closely follow a series of minor ones. Starting with the measurements and timing of the smaller quakes, a complex formula calculates the times of increased probability of a much larger quake. Right now, this method, like the first method, cannot predict specific times and places, but that may change as it is further developed. For the moment, none of these models can predict with reasonable levels of confidence.
Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to continue our discussion of human evolution by looking at Homo erectus, the earliest of our ancestors who stood upright. Homo erectus lived about 1.5 million years ago, and was given that name because, at the time the first fossil was discovered, it represented the first primate to stand upright. There is evidence now that Homo erectus had sharper mental skills than their predecessors. They constructed the first standardized tool for hunting and butchering. They created an extraordinary stone implement, a large teardrop-shaped hand axe, whose design and symmetry reveal a keen sense of aesthetics. This detailing, along with the axe's utilitarian value, strongly suggests that Homo erectus had the ability to conceive of and execute a design to specification. In addition, Homo erectus was the first hominid to use fire. This discovery enticed them to cook meat, which they could flavor and keep from spoiling by flame, and which paleontologists now believe may have given them a new disease. Some fossil bones of Homo erectus are grossly deformed, and paleontologists have noted that this condition is similar to that found in people today who have been exposed to chronic overdoses of vitamin A. Apparently, Homo erectus first got this disease by eating large amounts of animal liver.
Now let's focus on comics in the 1950s. Early in the decade, sales were down, so publishers started looking for some new angle to get their readers interested again. They found what they were looking for with horror comics, stories about ghosts and demons that were often graphically violent. Before long, most of the major publishers were printing horror comics. But it all came to an end a few years later. You see, there was a psychologist named Frederick Wertham who claimed that comic books, the horror books in particular, were a bad influence on children and turned them into juvenile delinquents. Wertham even wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent that showed specific scenes from comics that he thought were a particularly bad influence on kids. Wertham wasn't the only one down on comics. The United States Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency also released a report very critical of comics. The result of all this fuss was the creation of the Comics Code Authority in 1955. This was a self-censoring body created by the publishers. Essentially, for a comic book to be approved by the code, it had to be free of the blood and gore that was usually depicted in most horror comics. And evil could never triumph over good. Children had to be shown that crime did not pay. Well, if comic sales were bad in 1950, things got even worse in 1955. Many small publishers actually went out of business. But the industry rebounded by introducing a new lineup of superheroes, characters like Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four. Now, I've brought with me today some comic books from this era to pass around. They're from my own personal collection, so please be extra careful when handling them.
Welsh is a Celtic language spoken in Wales by about 740,000 people, and in the Welsh colony in Patagonia, Argentina by several hundred people. There are also Welsh speakers in England, Scotland, Canada, the USA, Australia and New Zealand. At the beginning of the 20th century, about half of the population of Wales spoke Welsh as an everyday language. Towards the end of the century, the proportion of Welsh speakers had fallen to about 20%. According to the 2001 census, 582,368 people can speak Welsh, 659,301 people can either speak, read or write Welsh, and 797,717 people, 28% of the population, claim to have some knowledge of the language. According to a survey carried out by S4C, the Welsh language TV channel, the number of Welsh speakers in Wales is around 750,000, and about 1.5 million people can understand Welsh. In addition, there are an estimated 133,000 Welsh speakers living in England, about 50,000 of them in the Greater London area.
A language dies when the last person who speaks it dies. But you know, sometimes people say it dies when the second last person who speaks it dies, because then the last person has nobody to talk to. Well, of course, languages have come and gone throughout history as communities have come and gone. But what's happening now is something really quite extraordinary. Well, there are about 6,000 languages in the world at the moment, more or less. Nobody knows the exact number. And of these, people think that about half of them are so seriously endangered that they're likely to die out in the course of the present century. Now, the present century is 100 years, half is 3,000 languages, so that means one language is dying out somewhere in the world, on average, every 2 weeks. There are all kinds of reasons why languages die. One is the physical reasons, when people are affected by famine and disease and earthquake. Another is genocide, when some countries deliberately try and stamp out a small language. But the main reason is globalization. That is, there are some huge languages in the world like English and Arabic and Spanish and French, and these are like steamrollers, crushing the smaller languages that they find in their path. A great deal can be done to preserve an endangered language. The first thing is that the people themselves must want the language to be preserved. That's very important. The second thing is that the powers that be must want the language to be preserved. They must have a respect for the minority languages that are in their care. And the third thing that has to be there, of course, is cash. It costs quite a lot of money to preserve an endangered language. Think about it. You have to train the teachers, you have to write books for the children, and all that sort of thing. It doesn't cost an extraordinary amount of money, but it does cost a bit. So without money, endangered languages don't have a positive future.
Let's take a look at this video of these little kids. They were offered the option of having one marshmallow immediately or 2 marshmallows 15 minutes later. And you've got some very cute videotape of this experiment, so let's take a look.
Okay. What we found is a very simple and direct way of measuring a competence that seems to make an important life difference.
A researcher tells these preschoolers that she's going to leave the room. If they wait for her to come back without eating the marshmallows, they'll get 2 marshmallows. Or they can ring the bell and she'll come back right away. But then they only get 1 marshmallow.
I won't ring the bell.
You won't ring the bell? Okay.
Looking at children over time, Dr. Michelle has found that being able to wait longer at 4 has some pretty powerful implications.
And what are those powerful implications? Is that that later in life they're more disciplined and have more self-control? Is that pretty much it?
Well, they are more likely to achieve their life goals. They have better relationships. They did better on their SAT tests.
I know, that's crazy. All because they waited 15 minutes for 2 marshmallows?
I mean, I think it is crazy. I probably would have eaten all 3. But
yeah, me too.
But, you know, actually, yes, the ability to be able to pursue your goals, in this case it was to have 2 marshmallows versus 1, and not go on automatic and just grab the marshmallow, is a very important skill. But I think a main point in Mind in the Making is that these skills can be taught if you're 14 or 40 or 4. It's not ever too late, and any child can learn them, any adult can teach them, and it's never too late.
This is a kind of object that you're probably all familiar with when you hear the term robot, but I'm going to show you the very, very first robots. These were the very first robots. They were characters in a play in the 1920s called Rossum's Universal Robots. And the play was written by a Czech writer called Karel Čapek. And basically, these robots, you know, people tend to think of robots as kind of cute, cuddly toys or, you know, Hollywood depictions kind of devoid of politics. But the first robots were actually created and imagined in a time of absolute political turmoil. You just had the First World War. Finnish, that had a devastating impact across Europe. And so people were kind of reflecting on what does it mean to be human, what makes us human, those kind of questions. And this kind of context is what inspired Čapek to kind of write this play. And interestingly, these robots being human, they are actually in the play assembled on a production line, a bit like the Ford manufacturing production line. So even though they are human, they are assembled, and these robots are designed to labour, and that is their primary purpose in society.
This busy little town is named after St David's first cousin. It's also a Welsh language stronghold. According to the 2001 census results, 70% of the town's population could speak Welsh. But even here, the language may not be completely safe. The Welsh Language Board expects last year's census results to show a fall in the number of Welsh speakers living in its northern and western heartlands. One of the main reasons for that, the board says, is migration. Many Welsh speakers are choosing to leave the country. At the same time, only a small percentage of those moving in can speak the language or choose to learn it.
Historically, over the past 70, 80 years, Welsh people have continually left in order to find better standard of pay, maybe, and quality of employment. The thing that's changed most probably is that there is a larger amount of English people now who have found Wales over the last 20, 25 years, particularly this corner of Wales, and regard it as a desirable place to come and live. And as opposed to many areas of England, I suppose, like the Cotswolds, cheaper as well.
With the help of the wealthy countries such as US, Vietnam became second largest coffee producer and exporter. This impacted other coffee producers like Colombia. The lecture is about the changes that have taken place in coffee production. Coffee production increased from 6 billion to 30 billion. The huge demand of Europe and America has made Vietnam the second biggest producer, which has greatly affected Colombia's production. The output of Central America is witnessing dramatic decrease. People's drinking habit also undergoing changes. Coffee was introduced to Vietnam in 1857 by the French and slowly grew as producer of coffee in Asia. The height of coffee production occurred in the early 20th century as small-scale production shifted towards plantations. By 2000, coffee production had grown to 900,000 tons per year. Price decreases, however, led annual production to drop to around 600,000 tons per year in 2003. In 2009, Reuters report Vietnamese coffee exports at an estimated 1.13 million tons for the previous year, stating that coffee was second only to rice in value of agro-products exported from Vietnam. The country's 2013-2014 coffee crop is expected to be a bumper harvest of around million to 29.5 million 60 kilogram bags. Such a large production will add to a global oversupply beans and will pressure coffee prices, which have lost about 10% since October 20. The country's coffee industry has taken a hit. Of the 127 local coffee export firms that operated in 2012, 56 have ceased trading or shifted to other businesses after having taken out loans they can't repay. A few firms, such as Vietnam's top coffee exporter the Intermex Group, will benefit from the 2013 harvest. Intermex accounts for a quarter of the country's coffee exports and made $1.2 billion in revenue in 2012. 6 billion to 30 billion make Vietnam's second largest coffee producer and exporter. Impact other coffee producers like Colombia and output of Central America decrease. Habit is also undergoing changes, important change. I'm a computer science and engineering professor here in Carnegie Mellon, and my research focuses on usable privacy. And so my friends like to give me examples of their frustrations with computing systems, especially frustrations related to usable privacy and security. Excuse me, so passwords are somethings that I hear a lot about. A lot of people are frustrated with passwords, and it's bad enough when you have to have one really good password that you can remember, but nobody else is going to able to guess. But what do you do when you have accounts on 100 different systems and you're supposed to have a unique password for each of these systems? It's tough. At Carnegie Mellon, they used to make it actually pretty easy for us to remember our passwords. The password requirement up through 2009 was just that you had to have a password with at least one character. Pretty easy. But then they changed things, and at the end of 2009, they announced that we were going to have a new policy, and this new policy required passwords that were at least 8 characters long, with an uppercase letter, lowercase letter, a digit, a symbol. You couldn't use the same character more than 3 times, and it wasn't allowed to be in a dictionary. Haussmann's renovation of Paris was a vast public works program commissioned by Emperor Napoleon III and directed by his prefect of the Seine, Georges-Eugène Haussmann, between 1853 and 1870. It included the demolition of crowded and unhealthy medieval neighborhoods, the building of wide avenues, parks and squares, the annexation of the suburbs surrounding Paris, and the construction of new sewers, fountains and aqueducts. Haussmann's work met with fierce opposition, and he was finally dismissed by Napoleon III in 1870, but work on his projects continued until 1927. The street plan and distinctive appearance of the center of Paris today is largely the result of Haussmann's renovation. In the middle of the 19th century, the center of Paris was overcrowded, dark, dangerous, and unhealthy. In 1845 the French social reformer Victor Considerant wrote, "Paris is an immense workshop of putrefaction, where misery, pestilence and sickness work in concert, where sunlight and air rarely penetrate. Paris is a terrible place where plants shrivel and perish, and where, of 7 small infants, 4 die during the course of the year." The street plan on the Taille de la Cite and in the neighborhood called the Quartier des Arcs, between the Louvre and the Hôtel de Ville City Hall, had changed little since the Middle Ages. The population density in these neighborhoods was extremely high, compared with the rest of Paris. In the neighborhood of the Champs-Élysées, there was 1 resident for every 186 square meters. In the neighborhoods of Arc-Is and Saint-Avoy, in the present 3rd arrondissement, there was 1 inhabitant for every 3 square meters. In 1840, a doctor described one building in the Taille de la Cite where a single room 5 meters squares on the 4th floor was occupied by 23 people, both adults and children. In these conditions, disease spread very quickly. Cholera epidemics ravaged the city in 1832 and 1848. In the epidemic of 1848, 5% of the inhabitants of these 2 neighborhoods died. Traffic circulation was another major problem. The widest streets in these 2 neighborhoods were only 5 meters wide, the narrowest were only 1 or 2 meters wide. Wagons, carriages and carts could barely move through the streets. The center of the city was also a cradle of discontent and revolution. Between 1830 and 1848, 7 armed uprisings and revolts had broken out in the center of Paris, particularly along the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, around the Hôtel de Ville, and around Montagne Sainte-Geneviève on the left bank. The residents of these neighborhoods had taken up paving stones and blocked the narrow streets with barricades, and had to be dislodged by the army.
But I'm going to focus on today is really different, larger forms of genetic variation involving essentially gains, losses, and inversions of sequence. So showing here is 30 in a simple diagram. We have an example of some structural variation operationally defined as events greater than a kb in size. So we have pieces of DNA that sometimes become deleted. We have pieces of DNA that sometimes become duplicated on chromosomes and regions which can be, in fact, inverted or turned around with respect to another orientation. So this very busy map here represents probably about 3 years of work in my lab, just to kind of characterize the general pattern of structural variation in 8 human genomes. So shown here are different human chromosomes from African or from non-African. The distinctions really aren't that important. But what I'm showing you here is the presence of insertions, deletions, and inversions as red, blue, and red, blue, green. And so each line here represents a different human genome that has been analyzed, looking for structural variation of events greater than 5,000 base pairs in size. So a couple things you can maybe get from this is that you can see there's a lot of genetic variation out there. This is above the level of a single base pair change, and most of the events that you're seeing here are essentially inherited. But we now know, based on studying roughly about 2,000 human genomes, but there's a significant fraction of a very large events, hundreds of kb in size, that are either individually specific or specific to specific families. So this is kind of changing our view of the dynamic nature of human genome.
Western country child birth rates. In the Western countries, women are becoming more and more reluctant to give birth to babies. However, the male status in society remains as strong as it ever has in recent years. The birth rates increased during the early 20th century, but it started to decrease over these last 2 decades. In the year 2000, as example, the birth rate remained at around 1%. There are even some negative birth rates in other countries. Birth rates dropped to their lowest point that has ever been seen in society. It also has impacts on males in society, especially young males. And it might even have some connection with unemployment rates as well.
When Australians engage in debate about educational quality or equity, they often seem to accept that a country cannot achieve both at the same time. Curriculum reforms intended to improve equity often fail to do so because they increase breadth or differentiation in offerings in a way that increases differences in quality. Further, these differences in quality often reflect differences in students' social backgrounds because the new offerings are typically taken up by relatively disadvantaged students who are not served well them. Evidence from New South Wales will be used to illustrate this point. The need to improve the quality of education is well accepted across OECD and other countries as they seek to strengthen their human capital to underpin their modern, knowledge economies. Improved equity is also important for this purpose, since the demand for high-level skills is widespread and the opportunities for the low-skilled are diminishing. Improved equity in education is also important for social cohesion. There are countries in which the education system seems primarily to reproduce existing social arrangements, conferring privilege where it already exists and denying it where it does not. Even in countries where the diagnosis might be less extreme, the capacity of schooling to build social cohesion is often diminished by the way in which schools separate individuals and groups. Education equality cannot ensure education quality. Education quality cannot ensure education equality. Countries fail to achieve both but now possible. Important government.
The Right Honourable Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was a British statesman, best known as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the Second World War. At various times a soldier, journalist, author, and politician, Churchill is generally regarded as one of the most important leaders in British and world history. Considered reactionary on some issues, such as granting independence to Britain's colonies, and at times regarded as a self-promoter who changed political parties to further his career. It was his wartime leadership that earned him iconic status. Some of his peacetime decisions, such as restoring the gold standard in 1924, were disastrous, as was his World War I decision to land troops on the Dardanelles. However, during 1940, when Britain alone opposed Hitler's Nazi Germany in the free world, his stirring speeches inspired, motivated, and uplifted a whole people during their darkest hours. Churchill saw himself as a champion of democracy against tyranny and was profoundly aware of his own role and destiny. Indeed, he believed that God had placed him on earth to carry out heroic deeds for the protection of Christian civilization and human progress. A providential understanding of history would concur with Churchill's self-understanding. Considered old-fashioned, even reactionary by some people today, he was actually a visionary whose dream was of a united world, beginning with a union of the English-speaking peoples, then embracing all cultures. In his youth, he cut a dashing figure as a cavalry officer, as seen in the 1972 film Young Winston, directed by Richard Attenborough, but the images of him that are most widely remembered are as a rather overweight, determined, even pugnacious-looking senior statesman, as he is depicted to the right.
A mild form of hallucination is known as a disturbance, and can occur in most of the senses above. These may be things like seeing movement in peripheral vision, or hearing faint noises and/or voices. Auditory hallucinations are very common in schizophrenia. They may be benevolent, telling the subject good things about themselves, or malicious, cursing the subject, etc. Auditory hallucinations of the malicious type are frequently heard, for example people talking about the subject behind his/her back. Like auditory hallucinations, the source of the visual counterpart can also be behind the subject's back. Their visual counterpart is the feeling of being looked or stared at, usually with malicious intent. Frequently, auditory hallucinations and their visual counterpart are experienced by the subject together. 1. Before we consider international environmental law and climate change, we need to consider domestic legislation, as it is within the sovereign states that international law is put into practice. This reflects the environmentalists' maxim, think globally, act locally. United Kingdom legislative control over the impacts of MONS activity on the environment is not new. As long ago as the reign of Charles II, the main concern was the production of smoke from the burning of sea coal. Almost all areas of trade and industry were subject to very detailed legislative controls at that time, although some were governed by self-regulation in the form of guilds, who regulated both supply and methods of production. However, the measures implemented were mostly ineffective because then, as now, the specifying of legal duties and standards without providing any appropriate enforcement merely indicated good intentions but were of little practical effect. The next stage was prompted by the Industrial Revolution with the urbanization of society and its profound effects on the environment. Local industrialists used the Adam Smith model to maximize their economic benefit, but this was to the detriment of the local environment with the operation of Gresham's law, that is, the bad drives out the good. Those industrialists who were concerned for either the health of their employees or the local environment faced higher costs than their competitors. The result was the need for increasingly comprehensive statutory controls on the discharge of pollutants into various receiving media. In this lesson, we discuss the similarities and differences between the eukaryotic cells of your body and prokaryotic cells such as bacteria. Eukaryotes organize different functions within specialized membrane-bound compartments called organelles. These structures do not exist in prokaryotes. Your body's composed of trillions of cells, lots of different types of cells that make up different organs and other parts of your body. Your body is also where 10 times that number of bacteria call home sweet home, but don't be afraid, these bacteria do more good than harm to you. And besides, just in case you wanted to strike up a conversation with your tenants, you and your bacteria do have a few things in common. All cells share some common characteristics that make them living things. All organisms are composed of cells, the basic fundamental unit of life. They contain DNA as a heritable genetic material, and they can reproduce. They transcribe DNA into RNA and translate RNA into proteins on ribosomes. They can also regulate transport across a cell membrane and require chemical energy for some cellular processes. Organelles are the biggest difference between bacteria and cells that make up the human body. Organelles. I believe our borders should be open. But if that is not politically acceptable for now, Europe should at least open up a legal route for people from developing countries to come work here. Over time, hopefully, we can move to a position where borders are completely open. Persuading skeptics won't be easy. That's why I think the argument for free migration has to be made at several levels: a principled case, it increases freedom and reduces injustice; a humanitarian case, it helps people much poorer than ourselves; an economic case, it makes us richer; and a pragmatic case, it is inevitable, so it is in everyone's interests to make the best of it. Freedom of movement is not just a matter of human rights and international solidarity, it is in our self-interest. Opening our borders may seem unrealistic. But so too, once, did abolishing slavery or giving women the vote. Campaigning for people's right to move freely is a noble cause for our time. 3 stages of brain development. Brain development during childhood. There are 3 stages, starting from the primitive brain, the action brain, limbic brain, feeling brain, and finally to the neocortex, thought brain. Although interrelated, the 3 had its own function. Primitive brain functions to manage the physical, to survive, manage reflex, motor motion control, monitoring body functions, and process information coming from sensing. Limbic brain functioning as a liaison to process emotions and the brain thinks, and the primitive brain, while the thinking brain, which is the most objective part of the brain, receiving input from the primitive brain and the limbic brain. However, he needed more time to process information from the primitive brain and the limbic brain. The brain thinks. The merger is also a place of experience, memory, feeling, and thinking ability to give birth to ideas and actions. Nerve myelination of the brain take place in sequence, starting from the primitive brain, the limbic brains, and brain thought. Neural pathways are more frequently used to make more myelin thicken. Increasingly thicker myelin, the faster the nerve impulses or signals travel along nerves. Therefore, a growing child is encouraged to receive input from the environment in accordance with its development.
This course provides students with an in-depth understanding of the exciting disciplines of politics and international relations. Students will learn about the workings of political institutions in countries around the world and explore the complex field of relations between nations. Topics in governments, public policy, public administration, national security, and border control ensure that students receive a broad and current education in the range of issues which are covered under the label of politics and international relations. Students will undertake 4 compulsory units in 2 majors, one in politics and international relations and the other in governments and policy. They will also choose an elective major from a wide choice of options, including political communication, international studies, international business, and national security studies. In addition to acquiring specialist knowledge and competencies in politics and international relations and commerce, students will graduate with a range of generic skills such as critical thinking, enhanced communication abilities, problem solving, and strong capacities to work with others. They will also develop ethically based and socially responsible attitudes and behaviors.
Our